Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier, where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features Her Christmas Hope by Bella Brown. All rights reserved. Chapter 1, Boston, 1880. There is no such thing as love. Eliza regarded her youngest daughter with a mixture of frustration and amusement. Cassidy Bell had always been contrary from the get-go, even though she was identical to her mother in looks. They had the same golden amber eyes and light brown hair that tended to curl. Whilst Eliza was eager to please everyone, Cassidy had always had an inherent cynicism. Her incredible fortitude meant that she got her way in almost everything, except relationships. Well, that's a silly statement to make, Cassie, darling. I loved your father, and now I love Ernest. I love you, and I love your brothers and your sisters. I love my home. Cassie lifted a sardonic brow at her mother, though refrained from giving her an eye roll. She was probably too old to be doing such a thing at 23. I'm sure that love for a child is entirely different to a husband, and I'm not sure how you can love bricks. But you're missing my point. I'm merely stating that love is an affliction that is conjured up in the minds of people. Her mother sighed. You're too young to be this pessimistic. Hardly, Mother. I'm practically middle-aged. By the time you were my age, you'd had 3 children. Cassie picked up the letters she'd shown to Eliza and slid them back in her bag. She had chosen to wear her favorite blue dress today as it complemented her slender figure well. This is a much more sensible solution to the problem. Eliza could feel the tears prick her eyes. You're making me feel like I should choose between you and my husband. Cassie's nostrils flared and she stamped down on the flash of guilt. That wasn't my intention, but Ernest has made it clear that I should move out if I won't do as he wants. Nonsense! Eliza sighed and gave a nervous laugh. He wants you and his son to be happy together. It would be nice to have shared grandchildren in more than one way. Mother, it would be almost incestuous. I look upon him as a brother. Ernest says that then your monies would be pooled together. No, Cassie said resolutely, I won't marry him. Her stepbrother was a foolish halfwit who drank too much and refused to work. But you'll traipse halfway across the world to marry a stranger? Eliza's voice clanged with incredulity. Cassidy, you have no clue as to who this man is, what he's like. You've exchanged a few letters and now you're betrothed to him. A stranger, she shrieked, her emotions becoming too much. Cassie had known that breaking news to her mother that she was leaving would be difficult. She also knew that she was the one child who caused her mother the most aggravation. Her siblings did what was expected of them. They all had a comfortable life, had good jobs, and had bred good children. Exactly what a Bell should do, according to her father. But he had died when she was young, and her mother had quickly married Ernest Hopkins. Cassie sighed, finished her tea. In all fairness, you didn't marry Ernest for love. It was for convenience, too. So how is this any different? It was entirely different, Eliza replied stiffly. We met appropriately. Ernest called upon me, courted me. You've exchanged some letters with a man who placed an advert in the Matrimonial Times. And now, you're upping sticks and trekking to the middle of the Colorado Territory. Cassie didn't want to repeat herself, that she had been writing to John Howard for almost 6 months before he had sent a proposal. Why can't you stay here and marry a proper man, someone decent from a fine, upstanding family? I've tried that, you know I have. You've seen the miscreants that have trotted through here for the past 6 years. They're all clods, boring, cut from the same cloth. Eliza's lips thinned in irritation. You didn't give them a chance. You had made your mind up before their hansoms had rolled to a stop outside. Cassie shrugged. That may be, but I did try. Her mother wouldn't know how she had longed to fall in love with someone, to feel something other than irritation and annoyance when listening to their dull conversations. that having to watch all her friends coo and get giddy over their gentlemen callers, only to eventually marry and fall away from her life, had been a source of consternation for years to her. And that is how she concluded that love didn't really exist. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm incapable of love. You just haven't met the right one. You should give it time. How long, Mother? I'm 23. I have no interest in having children. I don't possess the gene to put another before my own needs. That's why this arrangement with John Howard is perfect. He's an older man and has no interest in a love affair. He just wants someone to be a housekeeper, run the household, and be a companion to him on his large ranch. It's an entirely practical arrangement. Eliza shook her head and sighed. This is your wedding. It should be with bells and whistles, and lots of people gathered around to celebrate, to a man who you simply cannot get enough of. You've been reading too many romance novels, Cassie commented and pushed to her feet. My mind is made up. I leave next week. I assume that I will still be entitled to my dowry and the income. Cassidy, next month is Christmas. Can't you at least stay until the new year? Stay with me for one more Christmas? Cassie recalled the previous Christmas having to fend off a drunken Philip, Ernest's son, and didn't care to repeat having to barricade herself in her bedroom again. My ticket is booked, and why delay the inevitable? I'll be married and living in my new home as its mistress by Christmas. Eliza sat in her chair, long after Cassie had stalked from the room. She missed the days when she could round up her children and hold them all close. Whilst Cassie might claim to not be capable of loving someone, Eliza knew that losing her father when she was the apple of his eye had probably made her youngest wild child close herself off to the chance of love. As the clock chimed in the hallway, Eliza stood and readied herself for a farewell. She knew her daughter well enough not to try and tell her that marrying for convenience meant that the relationship was doomed from the start. She knew this better than anyone. The farewell dinner party had gone relatively smoothly, although Cassie had heard snippets of comments from Philip where he had lounged opposite her. They had a few of Ernest's friends as guests, more so to make up numbers rather than to offer comfort to Cassie. She knew that her stepfather wasn't happy with her decision to leave. Maybe that was why he'd invited people around, to join in with his scornful comments on her heading to the west. Yet, one look from Eliza had been enough to curb the more discourteous remarks. Cassie had been almost to her bedchambers when Philip stepped out of the shadows and lunged for her. She easily sidestepped him. "What are you doing here?" she hissed out. "Your room is on the other side of the house. I've come to claim what is rightfully mine." She folded her arms. "And what is that?" You're mine, Father told me so. You're just playing hard to get." He pounced for her, grabbing at her body. Instinctively, she lashed out. Her hand connected solidly with his face, and he stumbled, a hand clutching his cheek. "Everyone is right. You are an ice queen. There's something wrong with you," he snarled. Cassie sighed. "Go to bed, Philip. You're drunk again." He moved towards her when Kathy reached the top of the stairs. "Hi, miss. Do you need some help here?" Cassie saw her housekeeper and relief flooded her. "Yes, please, Kathy. Some help to my chambers would be most welcome," she said pointedly, looking at Philip. He growled and retreated, muttering about crazy women as he stomped back along the passageway. She thanked the housekeeper profusely and locked her door after the other woman had left. It was yet another reason why she needed to leave this city. Chapter 2. Cassie had left Boston, and a tearful Eliza filled with buoyancy. After the antics of her stepbrother, she had been itching to leave and get away from him and the acute embarrassment. She had chosen a teal-colored dress to travel in and matched it with a velvet half-bonnet and lace gloves. The train to the Colorado Territory had taken almost a week. Her carriage was full of fellow travelers of all kinds, and there was an air of excitement as the train puffed and hissed its way along the line. She had left the familiar sights of the city skyline and traveled through meadowland pastures before the train had climbed into the mountain range, negotiating its way along the edge of a cliff that fell away to the foaming white waters that flowed along the valley below. As the train climbed, she could see the snow-capped peaks poking out of the tree line. Spruce striking a sharp green color against the ghostly white of the aspen trees. And soon ponderosa pines replaced the alpine scenery before the train ground to its final stop with a metallic clunk. It was early December. The weather had changed considerably during her travels. As she stepped off the carriage, a dry mountain chill chased gooseflesh over her skin. The air seemed sharp, and all around her was a commotion. Cassie made her way to meet the stagecoach as arranged by John, swept along with the crowd as they filed off the platform. She found a young lad to help her with her luggage and slipped a coin into his grubby hand. The young lad half dragged and half carried her case to an area where there were stagecoaches gathered. Here, the furor became more urgent. Her small trunk was loaded on the top of the coach, and she climbed on, assisted up by the hand of a man. She turned to scowl at the offender and was met with a cheeky grin. "Pardon, ma'am," although his expression wasn't remotely repentant. "How long is this going to take? Where are you headin'?" "To Eagle's Peak." He sucked on his teeth. 2 days, give or take." Cassie was about to ask for clarification when the young man walked away. She snapped her mouth shut and squeezed herself into the seat next to the window. The coach was filled to the brim, and it rocked as more passengers climbed up onto the roof. She thanked her lucky stars that she was inside, as even though her legs were cramped up in the limited legroom, at least would be warmer. Cassie settled herself and set her carpet bag on her knee, her eyes roaming over the rest of the home station. She watched the other coaches in the various stages of loading up passengers, the tinkling of the horses' harnesses mixed with raised voices of crew and travelers. It was a strange scene to behold, and she found herself wondering where they were all heading for. She felt her bag being tugged and looked back to see a small, chubby fist playing with the hem of it. "Oh no, don't touch the nice lady's bag. There's a good girl." The mother of the child pulled her hand away. "My apologies," the young girl gave Cassie a quick smile. She's at that age where she wants to touch everything. Cassie didn't respond, unsure how to. Eyeing the small human in the same way she might a rabid dog, the little girl simply stared right back at her. "You said you're going to Eagle's Peak," the young girl asked. "I overheard you talking." "That's right. Us too." She indicated the man who was squished into the opposite window to Cassie, although he'd had to adjust himself more to accommodate his wide shoulders. He nodded and smiled before turning to look out the window once more. "Guess we'll have us some nice chats. My name is Adelia Murphy. This here is Hank, my husband. Nice to meet you. I'm Cassidy Bell." Shouts went up and the cab rocked once more as the driver hauled himself up. With a hee-yah, the coach lurched forward. Cassie grabbed at the leather handle as her head bounced off the side. Seeing stars, she had to ask Adelia to repeat herself. "I said, this here is my daughter Hope. Say hello to the nice lady, Hope." Cassie lifted a brow as Hope continued in her contemplation of her. Adelia made small talk, whilst Cassie struggled to keep up with how the young girl hopped between subjects. Now she realized why Hank had been so quiet. He probably never had the chance to get a word in edgewise with his young wife. So he got the job. "My ma said that we were crazy to up sticks and move, especially this side of Christmas. I hear the weather can be a bit wild, but I said, well, it's a job. There was no work back home. I don't mind that we have to start over. There will be a roof over our head on the farm, and I can just about make anything if I'm given some needle and thread. I'm sure I'll have the place shipshape before Christmas." Cassie didn't want to seem rude, but being jostled about and bumping over the road as they made their way down was making her feel nauseous. She turned to look out of the window, hoping that Adelia had finished so that she could enjoy the vista running past her window. But it seemed that she was just taking a breath. "Where are you from?" "Boston," Cassie replied, not turning around. "Why are you heading out this way?" "I'm getting married." Her matter-of-fact tone brought out a gush of delight from the young girl who took the opportunity to tell Cassie all about her wedding day to the reticent Hank. Cassie tuned out, eyes roaming over the scenery. They had left the home station and were racing along a track through a thicket of trees. Gray boulders peeked through the gaps. Beyond that were rough cliff faces with sparse bushes that gave way to spiky ponderosa pines. A sudden pain made Cassie grab for her hair. "Oh no! Hope, you mustn't do that. I'm so sorry. She's very curious. I took my eyes off her for just a second." Cassie winced as Adelia tried to unclasp the grip that the toddler had on her hair, tucking the ends back in and barely contained a sigh. "No matter," Cassie said. She gave the little girl a dirty look, who had resumed her staring contemplation from the lap of her mother once more. She had on a dark coat that had neat white scalloped edging. She had removed her bonnet and it was resting on Hank's leg. Whilst Cassie hadn't had much experience with small children, her nieces and nephews were as perfect as their parents. Cassie felt an odd kinship with this little firecracker. Checking her neat hat, Cassie asked, "How old is she?" "Coming up a year and a half. She's energetic and spirited." Adelia sounded both proud and weary at the same time. "I think us women have to be in these times. I think we're at a disadvantage for a lot of things. Let's pray that she keeps that attitude for later life." Adelia's smile was genuine. "That's a very nice thing to say, Miss Bell. Call me Cassie," she said. They'd stopped at several swing stations before they rolled to a stop in front of a boarding house where the driver announced that they would be stopping here for the night. When Cassie had asked why, he explained that they needed to rest the horses and wait for the new driver to arrive. Cassie climbed down and looked about her. Several windows of the property were lit up, and she could see some small outbuildings, but now that darkness had fallen, she couldn't see much more. The air was crisp, and her breath plumed in front of her face. She shivered as she waited for her trunk to be lowered down, and she tugged her collar up. Adelia and Hank passed by her, and Cassie bade them a good night back as they walked inside, arms linked. Adelia had dressed more appropriately for the weather, and Cassie eyed up her shawl with envy. Although she had been knocked and bounced about inside the stagecoach, being in such closeness to another person meant that she had been lovely and warm all day and not noticed the temperature drop until now. She enjoyed a supper of stew and washed it down with a cider. She listened to the conversations going on around her and heard that they still had another 2 days at least. She sighed as she climbed the stairs to her bedchambers. She only hoped that her new life was worth it because she would have to endure this journey in reverse if not. When she stepped outside the next morning, it was as if she had stepped straight into a winter wonderland. She took one look at the cold, fresh snow that now covered the ground and knew instantly that she had not packed appropriately for this inclement weather in this part of the world. She had woken that morning to the smells of coffee drifting through the house. She had taken a hearty breakfast at the wide table that had been scrubbed white over the years. The landlady of the boarding house was a no-nonsense, trim woman with salt and pepper hair, who brooked no arguments from the other passengers as they filed down for breakfast. Cassie narrowed her eyes against the fat, swirling flakes that hazed the area, trying to see through the low visibility, and then trotted across the yard to where the coach sat waiting. She could hear the raised, tetchy voices of the crew and noticed that the trunks and bags were quickly being thrown up on top of the coach. The white blanket had quickly turned to a sludgy quagmire around the heavy cartwheels, and this time, Cassie was grateful for the boost on her rump to help her in. Adelia had on a thick wool coat, and she had dressed Hope in a matching coat and snazzy bonnet. And the little girl was currently pulling on the end of the ties that secured it to her cherubic face. Cassie suppressed the smirk at the obvious discontent on her face. "Good morning," Cassie smiled as she squeezed herself in between Adelia and the carriage wall. "Morning, Cassie. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, surprisingly, although I'm a tad stiff from being rocked about so much yesterday." Adelia gave her a knowing smile. "I heard the driver say that we're going up over a pass today, so I'm guessing it will be much of the same. Although they don't seem very happy, it appears we're running behind already." Cassie settled her bag on her knee, careful to keep the handles from the clutches of Hope's curious hands. "You've dressed well for the occasion at least." "You don't have a coat with you?" Cassie shook her head. "I shall have to send for my items once I've settled in, as I'm not nearly well equipped enough." She pictured the fine gowns and fancy hats that she had chosen to bring with her, including a fine silver dress to wed John Howard in. "Here." Adelia produced a heavy woolen blanket and handed it to Cassie. She promptly wrapped it over her shoulders like a shawl, copying how she had seen the other women passengers wear one. Soon enough, She felt her body begin to warm up. "Thank you, Adelia." The stage departed and Cassie gritted her teeth as the rocking started again. Cassie chatted to Adelia for a while, as the conversation took her mind off how uncomfortable she was. The young girl was quite a breath of fresh air. Hope let out a whine, a noise to let the coach passengers know that she wasn't happy. Adelia tried to soothe her distress, cooing to her and rubbing her back, but the child was squirming. "What's the matter with her?" "I think it's the traveling. She took a while to settle last night." She carried on, trying to ease her daughter's obvious discomfort. Cassie squinted around the edge of the leather shade that covered the window. Yesterday she had watched the world roll past her. Today it was far too cold to allow the frosty air into the cab. Although the air inside the coach had warmed up soon enough, her toes were like ice inside her boots. The conversation milled about her and she listened with half an ear. It felt like they had been steadily climbing for an age. She wasn't sure about how sensible it was to be traveling when she could barely see the trees looming through the frosty mist. The snowfall had stopped now, but it was still murky, and she had to trust that the drivers had used this route often enough to know the road well. There was a retching noise, and Cassie turned just in time to see Hope vomit over her mother's lap, and some of it being projected over Cassie's skirts. In the dimly lit interior, Adelia handed her daughter over to Hank as she proclaimed over the smell and produced a hanky. "I'm so sorry, Cassie." Cassie wrinkled her nose, reaching up to undo the window shade to allow Adelia to see better with the cleanup. "Don't worry," she muttered. Hope cried out some more, reaching for her mother, and Hank gave her up so that she could crawl across to her ma. An exasperated Adelia tried to placate her daughter, and she sat her on the knee closest to Cassie to clean her daughter up. The cry that went up from outside was heard at the same time as the coach stopped rolling. Instead, it jerked them all sideways. With a gasp, Cassie reached for the leather handle. Suddenly, the world tilted violently. Cries of the passengers mixed with screams of the horses, and a loud crack. Cassie's ears filled with noise, her screams renting the air. There was a moment, a drawn-out moment where the world seemed to stop. Then the coach pitched over and tumbled down the side of the hill. Chapter 3. Flynn. Flynn Reid urged his big bay mare on, having to duck to avoid the branch that lay low across the path. He had pulled his neckerchief up and over his nose to stave off the cold. Moisture beaded on his woolen short jacket, and he tugged at the edges of the leather overcoat, buttoning them back together. The fresh dump of snowfall had mostly obscured the road that ran over the small hill, but he had ridden this route many a time, traveling between the small towns that lay in valleys on either side of the foothills. He pictured a roaring fire and a whiskey to give some fire in his belly, his mind wandering as it did. All around him the world was silent, and he felt almost cocooned in a misty winter morning. His horse's ears alerted, and her step faltered slightly as her attention was taken. His senses screamed to life, and his gaze scanned the immediate vicinity, his ears tuned to what had spooked her. All the bears would be underground at this time of the year, but there may be a hungry wolf or a bandit that was observing them somewhere. He tapped her sides with his heel, and the mare walked on, her little brown ears swiveling, and her breath pluming into clouds out of flaring nostrils. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running a gloved hand along her neck. "What is it?" He saw the tree line first, and squinted to bring into focus what his eyes saw before it was swallowed by the mists once more. As the cloud cleared, he saw it again. There was a break in the tree line, where the land had broken away from the road, leaving a big swathe in the landscape. He was about to click his tongue when a bright yellow object snagged his attention. His heart rolled over in his chest. Where had it come from? As he neared the site, he could see more items. This wasn't just a landslide. There had been people in its path. "Come on, girl." He pushed his mare on, his senses now on full alert as he neared the edge of the road. He peered over the hill and saw the devastation. Luggage, a wheel, blood red spilling over the white snow and mixing with the brown of the trees that had been broken up like matchsticks. He jumped down from the horse. "Hello," he called out. "Anybody there? Can anyone hear me?" His voice echoed out through the forest, but the silence resumed long after his resonance died off. He tried again. His eyes raked the ground, unsure of how stable his footing might be should he venture down, but he needed to see for himself. He tossed the reins over a nearby tree branch and began to pick his way over the debris, following the wide path of devastation. He stepped over a splintered length of wood that had been varnished on one side and knew that this was bigger than a plain wagon. He saw the horses first and hoped that their end had been swift. He happened upon the wreck of the remainder of the carriage and sucked in a breath. There were bodies everywhere, mangled in with the wreckage, broken and unrecognizable. Dear Lord, I pray that you look upon these poor souls and take them straight into your home. He began to pray, then spun on a heel at the sound of a twig snapping behind him. He saw her first. She limped awkwardly and was bloodied up, her blonde hair in disarray around her face. Her eyes swung wildly about her, involved in the horror that she saw all about her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Flynn called out. "Hey!" he shouted, when she didn't seem to respond. He could see now she had a wide gash over her forehead. Her teal dress was stained dark, and he wondered if she was injured elsewhere too. "Everyone is dead," she whispered as she whirled on the spot. "Everyone is dead." Flynn approached her, held his arms wide as if she were a filly about to bolt. "It's okay. You're okay," he used a soft tone. "You're bleeding," she repeated her mantra, eyes roaming over the broken stagecoach. Flynn stepped up to her, his broad chest blocking out the view. "You're okay, ma'am. Hey, what's your name?" Golden Eyes saw him for the first time, and she blinked at the cowboy who stood before her. "Cassie," she whispered. "My name is Cassidy Bell." Flynn nodded, his mouth curving up into a reassuring smile. "That's good. Well done. It's nice to meet you. I'm Flynn. Tell me, were you traveling with others?" When she nodded, he pressed on. "A stagecoach?" "How many people were on there with you?" 8 other passengers inside and the 2 drivers and some others up top. A shotgun and a driver," he smiled kindly, knowing that those people were higher up the hill. But he kept that bit to himself. Not many would survive a stagecoach rolling over them. "Do you know how long ago this happened?" "I don't know. I woke up in the snow over there." She lifted an arm as an indication. He nodded in agreement. "Have you seen anyone else?" He was trying to calculate how many bodies he'd seen. "No," she whispered, her beautiful eyes filling with tears. "There's no one." She began to shake violently and promptly turned and threw up. He patted her back. "Good girl, let it out," he murmured, his eyes scanning over the area once more. He could see the wrangled wreck more now. He needed to get back to town, get some help up here, to try and retrieve these bodies before the wildlife started in on them. It was the cough that drew his attention first, a small cough and a sigh. Then he saw her. She had on a thick wool coat and blonde curls. She rubbed her nose, glancing about her with a look of disgruntlement. "Ma'am," Flynn tapped Cassie on her back. "Ma'am, do you?" Cassie had heard the noise too. She turned and looked and gasped. "Oh my, Hope!" Cassie started to run, tears streaming down her face, as she began to sob. "Hope, you're alive." Hope spotted the pair of them and pushed to her feet, lifting her arms expectantly as the adults reached her. The girl seemed oblivious to the sobbing woman who hugged her to her chest. "Is she yours?" Cassie shook her head. "No, sir. I was sat next to her mother. Hope was on her lap. I was by the window." She told him of the final few moments as she had undone the leather shade before the world had gone mad. "You both must have been thrown clear through the window," Flynn said as she pressed a kiss to the squirming baby. Cassie gasped and kissed the little girl again. "She saved my life," she murmured. "Maybe there are more of us alive." Flynn instinctively wanted to protect them. "Miss Bell, I don't think you need to see." But he may as well have saved his breath. She passed him the toddler and began to hunt through the wreckage, calling out as she went. Chapter 4. Cassie. When she had first opened her eyes, the world has seemed without color, without sound, and she wondered for a moment if this was heaven. But then her senses came screeching back, the metallic tang of blood in her mouth and the acute throbbing that wreaked havoc on her body. It was as if her senses were too alive now, and the pain that she was in drowned out everything else. As she struggled into a sitting position, her memory came flooding back. The stagecoach? The world caving in. Now, as she pulled up pieces of disintegrated wood, stepped over luggage that had exploded open, and strewn its contents, she tried to block out the sights that she knew would be emblazoned on her mind for as long as she drew breath, focusing only on her task. She just kept thinking that if she had survived, if Hope had been thrown free, maybe others had been knocked unconscious. She ignored the pleas of Flynn to stop, pushed on despite the burning that roared through her side, making her breath stall in her lungs. Why her? Why had she been the one to survive? What was so special about her? When she saw Hank's still body, she sobbed, her breath hiccuped out of her. Adelia? Where was Adelia? That sweet, chatty girl. Cassie, come on. There. She saw the familiar blue coat that she had admired that very morning. She pulled up the branches that had covered her, lifted a long side of wood that had been a part of the coach, and dropped to her knees. Adelia? Cassie brushed her hair back. Can you hear me? Cassie gasped as Adelia's eyes fluttered briefly. Adelia, it's me, Cassie. Open your eyes, please. Her frown pulled her brows together as she let out a breath on a tiny puff. Adelia. Cassie laughed as the eyelids parted and she could see the pale blue. That's it, Flynn. Over here. Her joy at finding another survivor boomed over her. She raked her eyes over the young woman's body, stopping when she saw the large piece of wood protruding from her. Oh no, she murmured. As good as that, Miss Cassie? Adelia's voice was thready and her breathing was shallow. Mama! Hope squealed in delight and Adelia's eyes flew open, searching. Here, she's here. Cassie accepted the little girl as Flynn passed her back. Hope immediately wanted to crawl onto her mother, but she had to hold her off. Cassie looked to Flynn for help, but his expression was grave as he turned from Adelia's injury, and he gave a single shake of his head. Tears filled Cassie's eyes as she gazed down at the young woman. You're going to be fine, Cassie said around a watery smile. Adelia smiled and her eyes drifted shut. You wouldn't make a good poker player, Miss Cassie. She huffed out a breath. Save your energy. Adelia, we'll go get you some help. Adelia lifted a hand, reaching blindly for Cassie's hand. I know. This is my time. I feel it. Cassie took the hand. No, she sniffed. Please, let me go to my lord with a clear mind. Her eyes sprang open once more, and she pinned Cassie with a look. Will you promise to take care of Hope? I'll find your family. I will make sure of it. Cassie nodded. Make sure she's raised as a good Christian girl. Tears leaked from her eyes, and she gasped as more pain washed through her. You raise her, Miss Cassie. You take her to your husband and raise her. Tell her that her ma and her pa loved her. She released Cassie's hand to reach for her neck, tapping the neckline of her dress. My locket, Adelia breathed. It was my grandma's. I want you to have it for taking care of her. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure she has it to grow up with. Cassie whispered. Adelia's eyes opened once more as Hope leaned over to touch her mother's cheek, laying the chubby little fist against it. Adelia smiled, her eyes upon her daughter before finally her body stilled. Flynn looked up at the sky as the ominous-looking clouds dimmed below daylight more. Let's get you both back up to the road, he told her. Cassie was still kneeling next to the body of her friend, whispering her prayers as she held her hand. I'll come and have a closer look at the rest of the wreck. You don't need to see any more than you have done. Cassie straightened up, setting the toddler to one side as she carefully pulled the gold chain from Adelia and unhooked the clasp. She dropped the locket into her pocket and then accepted his proffered hand as he helped her to her feet. Here, I'll take her, he said, swinging the little girl up easily as his long legs crossed the ground. He stopped and checked over his shoulder, having to walk back for Cassie as she paused, a hand on her hip as she bent at the waist. She had turned a funny shade again. Don't you go passing out on me, he muttered, scooping her up over his shoulder and carried them both easily over the soft, uneven ground of tree and mud mix. He had seen the dark patch spreading over the bodice of her dress at the side and knew that she was injured under that. He also knew how to read the clouds enough to know that there was a storm coming in. The young toddler tapped his spiky cheek as he strode on, and he ignored her, his mind racing over what he needed to do next to help these two people. Chapter 5. Cassie. By the time she was set back on her feet, the pounding that had been in her head when she first woke had returned with a vengeance. The man cast a concerned look over her as he unhooked a flask with one hand and passed it to her after taking a swig himself, squeezing his forearms together to undo the lid. You're injured, he pointed to her side and to her head, and Cassie looked down at where the fire was in her ribs. And there's a snowstorm coming. Cassie took the flask and sipped. How far are we from the nearest town? A day's walk at least, possibly 2 if you're injured. She scrubbed a weary hand over her face, wincing as her fingers touched the scrape on her forehead. We had best start walking? "Oh no, ma'am. We're going to lose the light very soon, and you need to patch yourself up," Cassie gestured. "With what? We're not exactly being overrun with doctors and medical supplies. There's a cave up over there. It's tough going, especially as we're going to have to traverse that landslide," he nodded. "But it will be dry in there and we can light a fire, get some rest, and start again in the morning if the weather is on our side." "A cave?" She looked aghast at him. Flynn nodded. "Over there." Cassie thought about protesting and calling his suggestion ridiculous, but then remembered that she was in the middle of nowhere with a perfect stranger in a strange land. Right now, she needed him. He had a way about him that seemed to soothe her. "Okay, hold her," he passed Hope back. "I won't be a minute. Where are you at?" But he was already walking away, striding off into the mists. "Flynn," she called his name when the silence around her got too much. Hope echoed the noise, breathing heavily as her head swiveled. "I'm here," he called back. "Don't worry." Relief flooded through her, and she rocked Hope to her, grateful for the tonic of her comforting warm body. The little girl was fiddling with the top button of her coat, concentrating on trying to remove the offending object. Cassie was struck by how much she looked like her mama, and was overwhelmed with a wave of sadness. The little girl was now an orphan. She had survived a devastating accident, and she was only concerned with a button. Holding Adelia's hand, watching that vibrant young woman take her last breath before her spirit left this world, Cassie had felt something shift inside. She vowed to track down Adelia's family and follow through on her promise. Flynn appeared in the mists, and Cassie saw him properly for the first time. He was broad and tall, his collar tucked up close around his ears and a black cloth wrapped around his throat. He had calm gray eyes that held hers as he approached, laden down with clothing and blankets. "I grabbed what I could. I don't know if they will fit you, but there should be something here you can use." He saw she was about to protest and added, "You're shivering, cold and wet, and you're wearing not nearly enough for a winter in Colorado." He set the clothing to one side. "You get up on Nutty here. I'll pass Miss Hope up to you. It'll be faster." He grabbed his mare by the bridle and lifted his head, telling her to mount the horse. When she blinked at him, he lifted a brow. "What?" "I don't know how to. I've never ridden a horse." To his credit, he refrained from the sigh that she guessed he would normally have given, instead showing her how to put a foot in the low stirrup and swing her leg in over. She passed Hope back to him, and then she hopped about a few times, his mare standing stock still, until he stepped forward to hook an arm around her middle and threw her up unceremoniously with a jerk of his shoulder. He watched as she righted herself. "Okay?" She gritted her teeth and reached down for Hope, a breath hissing out with pain as her little foot caught her ribs on the way up. "Okay," Cassie agreed. Flynn collected the belongings that he'd rescued from the crash and clicked his tongue, then set off through the trees, picking the clearest way through. Cassie gripped the pommel in front of her as his horse simply followed Flynn without being led. The mist began to clear as the wind picked up. The air was sharp and damp, and as the horse weaved her way through the forest, her hooves were soundless on the carpet of needles underfoot. Cassie bit her lip as the fire in her side grew in intensity as she was rocked about in the saddle. It would be pointless complaining about it. There wasn't much that they could do to help. Hope seemed delighted, sitting astride the saddle and patting the flanks of the animal, chattering away to her new friend. Tipping her face up, Cassie could see the sky had taken on that strange hue before the snow, a muted light. Tiny flakes broke through the treetops, and by the time they reached the edge of the tree line, the snow fell in fat flakes. Cassie ducked her head as the wind slapped the flakes into her cheeks, which stung her eyes. She pulled Hope closer to her, using her body to shelter the worst of it from the child, holding an open palm across her face. Cassie saw the mouth of the cave, a gaping hole in the side of the hill that had a narrow footpath sweeping up to it, tapering as it reached its apex. The wind had picked up enough that made walking treacherous, and she knew that Flynn had made the correct call. Trying to traverse a trail in inclement weather would have been suicide. She'd seen enough death today to last a lifetime. His horse picked her way carefully over the loose stones of the path. Sure-footed as Cassie found herself leaning closer to the animal, patting the flank to push her on, much as she had seen Hope do. "Wait here," Flynn called. Nutty stopped, her ear pricked forward as she awaited the return on her master. He returned moments later, having set the blankets inside. "No bears," he replied at Cassie's questioning look. Cassie was aghast. It hadn't even occurred to her about wild animals, and she looked about her fearfully, but was promptly taken down from the horse and hustled inside the cave. Chapter 6. The sudden silence was strange. Inside, the cave was dry but had a pungent smell emanating from deep inside. She turned to see Flynn, leading his mare inside behind him, and looped her reins around a boulder. He clapped the mare on her shoulder, who replied by dropping her nose, and began to snuffle around the dried grass, needles, and rocks around her hooves. He glanced around inside, the darkness yawning before them. Cassie could see where there had been a recent fire, the scorched earth surrounded by a circle of rocks. In the center of a collection of boulders, Flynn reached inside one of his saddlebags, pulled out an axe and a long-sheathed knife, and a leather sack. "Take a seat, I won't be long." "Where are you going?" "Firewood," he called over his shoulder, as he stepped once more into the storm. Cassie waited a few moments and closed her eyes. The tapping hand on her face made her eyes open, and she met Hope's cool blue gaze. "You're right," Cassie replied on a sigh. "We'll be fine. He'll be back. He must know this hill. He led us here, didn't he? We shouldn't panic." In response, Hope squirmed furiously and demanded down, and Cassie set her on her feet. Hope's hands went to the floor when she scooped up hands full of the dirt before tossing it. Cassie watched the little girl as she explored her surroundings. The cave had rough walls, and there had clearly been other occupants, judging by the creature smells and animal bones in the fire ashes. Cassie put a hand on her side, her fingers feeling round, and she felt the ripped fabric. She tried to see, but the cave was too dark. She stepped over to the entrance to have a look, but the sudden temperature drop made her violent shivering begin again. She chatted to the horse, to Hope, to the cave, trying to stave off the wave of panic, to keep her mind off the pain in her skull, to hold off the vision of the broken bodies strewn down the hillside not far away from where she was. Flynn. He rounded up as much kindling as he could, kicking up fallen branches for the drier bark and sticks, and chopping up the larger sections, storing them in his knapsack. He tried to keep his mind off the poor souls who had lost their lives this morning, instead keeping to the forefront of his mind to help those that he could. Right now, a brave young woman and a helpless child needed him. He set off for the crash site, knowing that they all needed to eat tonight and that he didn't have time to set a trap or go hunting. As his old ma used to tell him, beggars couldn't be choosers. Cassie. Relief flooded her as she saw Flynn's big frame looming in the entrance to the cave. She gave him a watery smile, and he stumbled as her liquid gold eyes danced at him. "You're back." She had huddled under the blanket he'd retrieved and cradled Hope, waiting for the shivering to abate. He gave her a brief nod, reached into his saddlebag once more. He set about lighting the fire, and Cassie watched fascinated as the sparks hit the kindling, and the flame took a hold of the fuel. She had to stop Hope from trying to help Flynn, and she squealed in protest at not being allowed to go where she wanted to go. "There's clothing over there. I think I found her ma's bag as I found clothing for a child in it." Cassie was touched that he had considered their needs so. "I'll change her now." Hope was compliant as she'd ever been, sitting on Cassie's lap as she stripped off the coat and the cotton dress and her underthings. Her little body had escaped unscathed. Other than the abrasion on her arm and bruised legs, she gave the little girl a drink and some dried meat that Flynn had had in his pack, and greedily guzzled at the water from the canister herself. Once the flames roared to life, Cassie could have wept as the heat swept over her. She held out a hand to the warmth and felt her fingertips spear in pain as the blood started to flow back into them once more. "Right. Let's get you out of this wet dress." Her eyes slid to Flynn in question. "Come again?" He crossed over to where the pile of clothing lay. "You're injured and you won't thaw out as long as you're in that wet dress." "But where do I change?" Flynn tossed his hat onto one boulder. "I will turn my back," he chuckled. "I need to check that injury." "Are you a doctor?" No, ma'am, but I've seen my share of injuries to know that they need to be checked. She wanted to protest, but the urge to be dry and warm was more than she could bear. Fine, pass me what you have. He gave her a simple gray shift and a long wool coat. Dutifully taking a sleepy Hope in his arms, Cassie crept to the corner, away from the delightful heat, and set the clothes down. It soon became obvious that she needed help. Every time she twisted to undo the fastening at the back, her side roared in pain. She gasped and he asked, "What's wrong? I can't do it." He had his back turned to her, and Hope peered over his shoulder at her. "Do you need help?" She let out an exasperated growl. "Yes." He crossed over to her, setting Hope down, then angled her towards the fire so that he could see, and deftly undid the tiny buttons at the neck. "I can do the rest," she told him quickly, as his cool fingers touched her nape and the damp skin between her shoulder blades, the skin zinging to life at his touch. She kept her back to him. Wordlessly, he stepped away and turned his back. She moaned in pain as the material of her dress tugged on the injury. "What? It burns like nobody's business." "It will do. I imagine the blood has dried to the skin by now. Look, just cover yourself for decency's sake and let me take a look." The dim cave covered her flaming embarrassment as she acquiesced, and he turned round. She had the shift pressed to her chest, exposing a long creamy back that was marred by a long red gash across her rib cage. "We need to clean it. Get yourself dressed, and we can settle this one so that my hands are free." He turned away from her all businesslike as she dressed once more. The dress was baggy and shapeless on her. The skin around her injury was tender, but having dry fibers against her skin was such a treat. She didn't much mind the ache in her side. She crept back over to the fire to see that he had swaddled up Hope, and she was now fast asleep in his arms, a thumb plugged into her red lips as she slept. Cassie looked down on the little girl and felt a rush of tenderness. Gosh, I'm so glad she doesn't know that today her life changed forever. For sure, it's a blessing, but it's a shame she won't remember her parents. Cassie accepted the little girl as Flynn passed her back and held her close. How could she feel all this emotion for someone that wasn't her flesh and blood? She dismissed the feeling, telling herself she was just overwrought from the day's events. She needed to get Hope back to Adelia's family where she belonged. She settled her down against the floor, tucking the blankets up around her, and brushed a hand over her downy cheek. "Okay, let's take a look," Flynn murmured. She noticed he had the canister with water in that he had filled with snow earlier, a small tin, and some rags. "Sit there so I can see," Cassie sighed. She may as well get this over with, although exposing her body like this to a stranger just wasn't appropriate. She sat on the boulder next to his as he tended to the cut on her forehead, and then, at his prompt, slipped a shoulder out of the shift dress and gritted her teeth as he washed the wound. His touch was firm yet gentle, and she ignored the tingling that it seemed to bring. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, trying to distract herself. When he remained quiet for so long, she wondered if he'd heard her and was about to repeat the question when he replied quietly, "War." She nodded a little bit. In her lifetime, it had been a time of repairing and healing for the country, and none of the conflicts had touched her life. She felt lucky. "I suppose that we're all survivors then," she murmured. He applied on a pace that smelled foul, and she lifted her arm so she could see better. "What is that?" "It's a balm that will help with the healing. I got it off the medicine woman in Eagle's Peak," he added. "Now quit moving and sit still." A brow lifted at his tone. She wasn't nearly used to being dictated to in such a manner, but remained mute. He applied a crude bandage, looping it around her middle, moving very close to her as he passed it around her waist so that his face was close to hers and that his breath moved over her bare skin. She told herself that the goosebumps were from the cool air, not the awareness that being near to him seemed to awaken in her. She had steeled herself so much that she didn't realize he'd moved away until he was feet away and said, "You can dress again." She tucked her shoulder back in and slipped the shawl over her shoulders. More pans were rattling and a sudden sizzle. She turned and watched as Flynn had set a crude spit over the fire, where he'd stuck a stick through the center of a chunk of raw meat. He stared into the flames as he slowly turned the spit. Cassie claimed a seat opposite him, staring at the meat. "You went hunting?" she asked him. Not exactly. Her gaze sharpened on his shadowed face. What does that mean? I'm hungry, and we don't have either time or options to set traps and wait for a little bunny to hop along. Cassie stared at the large chunk of flesh that he was slowly rotating as her mind raced. That's a horse? She asked eventually. Flynn shrugged. Best we get there before the wild animals get it. Her eyes widened in horror at her next thought. Will they eat the... That's why we need to get to the town quickly. Send up some people to retrieve what's left so these people get a proper burial. Cassie's eyes pricked at what her imagination was showing her, and she turned away, horror rolling through her. Was there no end to this dreadful situation? Look, you're in the West. We don't have fancy cities and big hospitals. We have wild animals and wild territory. You shouldn't have come out here if you can't stomach what happens here. Her eyes snapped back to his, sparks flying. I'm sorry if my revulsion is offensive. He glanced up, and she met that gray gaze head-on, lifting her chin. The firelight danced over the angular planes of his face, and with the stubble on his chin, he looked quite menacing. Still, Cassie held the stare, refusing to back down. What are you doing in these parts, anyway? He asked. I was traveling to meet my future husband. Chapter 7. His face remained expressionless, although his eyes dropped to her lips. Where is he from? Somewhere near Eagle's Peak. He was meeting the coach. His name is John Howard. Flynn turned the spit, poked at the fire. He's a lot older than you are. You know him? He nodded. Of him, I'm from Eagle's Peak. That explained how he knew the mountains so well. What's he like? She asked quietly. You've traveled here to marry someone, and you don't know what he's like. That's right, he placed an advertisement looking for a wife, and I answered it. We've been corresponding. Flynn laughed. You're either brave or crazy. I'm not yet sure which. You sound like my mother, she retorted, and his laugh deepened. What are you running from? She tilted her head. What makes you think that? That seems like the only explanation for someone to trek across the country and leave everything familiar. Especially if you have a family telling you that it was a mistake. There was an instant where she was back inside that coach and the world was a terrible noise. Was it a mistake? She was sensible enough to believe that the Lord had chosen her to survive that awful crash, though she was not yet sure of the reasons behind it. I was not running away. There was just nothing in Boston for me anymore. No other beaux in a whole city. Flynn lifted the spit off and set it down onto the leather pouch, began to hack at it with his knife. Either you're fussy or scared. Cassie prickled at his assumptions that she was a spoiled socialite. If you finished in the character assassination, decisions were being forced upon me by my family that didn't sit well. I choose my own destiny. I won't be dictated to by a man. Flynn handed her a can filled with meat chunks, amusement glinting in his gaze. Eat, he told her, lips curving. Now. Cassie almost didn't, just to prove a point, but the seared meat scent filled her nose and her mouth watered. She snatched at the can and bit into the meat hungrily, the juices running unchecked over her chin. Flynn continued in his contemplation of her, and the unbridled satisfaction she had at filling her belly. How long have you been writing? To John Howard. She caught a drip with her forearm, wiped her mouth at the same time. 6 months. It takes the letters 3 or 4 weeks to get through. He seemed to be a good match. He isn't looking for a wife in the truest sense. He wants someone to help run the ranch, keep his larder in order. Flynn's brow climbed up his head. You're marrying to become his housekeeper? She studied the meat in her can, avoiding his curious stare. Why not? Because that's possibly the worst reason ever? Why is it? It's sensible. As you said, he's an older man. We've entered into an agreement whereby neither of us wants children, neither of us believes in love. We don't want the physical side of a relationship, and I believe we will make good companions, and that's all you can ever want in someone to grow old with. You think he won't want a physical relationship when he claps eyes on you? Flynn gave her a skeptical look. What about falling in love? What about sharing your life and hopes and dreams? She lifted a shoulder. Somehow her justifications and reasons about love seemed trivial now she voiced them to this strange man. What about it? I'm not even sure it exists. Love doesn't exist? She shook her head. not the one that you read about in novels." "I see," he replied when he clearly didn't. "Have you ever been in love?" she asked, pausing to look up at him. It was his turn to study his food, and he waited before answering. "Once," he said eventually. "She died. It was a long time ago." He added and set his can down with a clatter. "I just can't believe that someone as young as you feels like that and is going to link her life to such an old goat." Strangely, his disdain for her decision stung more than her mother's had. She forked up another morsel, chewed it carefully in the silence. "What will you do about the child? You've already said that John Howard doesn't want children." Cassie's eyes slid to Hope, where she slept soundlessly. It hadn't even occurred to her that she would have to explain to John. "She can stay with us whilst I track down her family. It shouldn't take too long." Flynn laughed again. "Where was Adelia from?" "A town called Foxbury," she said. "I'll write to the governor and ask for assistance. I don't know their last names, but Hope will stay with me as long as it takes." "You thought this through then?" Cassie shook her head. "Not really. As mistress of the house, I should have some say of what goes on in it, though." Flynn looked as though he didn't believe her for a moment. Cassie changed the subject. "How long to get to Eagle's Peak?" "A day at most, though it may take 2, depending on the weather. If this storm clears out and the snowfall isn't too deep." "Sounds like a lot of variables." "This here is the Wild West, ma'am," Flynn said. "That's all we got, variables and unpredictability." He picked up his hat and a blanket and proceeded to settle down for the night nearest to the entrance, laying on his back after bundling the blanket behind his head, stretching his long legs out in front of him. Cassie's eyes roamed across his prone form and sighed. She set her can down, having saved a few of the cubes that she'd cut for breakfast tomorrow. She lay down next to Hope, curling her body around the tiny form of the sleeping child, and settled a blanket over the both of them. She watched the glowing embers of the fire for a moment before her gaze slid to the wide opening that was currently blocked by the rump of his horse, and nerves tickled the back of her throat. "Flynn?" He grunted. "Those animals you mentioned. Will they come back in the cave tonight?" "Shouldn't do," he said, then opened one eye. "You should get some sleep. You've had one hell of a day." She gave him a quick smile. But her eyes rested on the dark opening beyond where the light from the fire reached. "If something comes by, Nutty will let us know," he said again. In the end, he tisked and stood up, crossing to her side of the fire. "Scoot over," he told her, taking up the space nearest the exit. He lay back down, repositioned himself, and closed his eyes on a sigh. Within minutes, his breathing changed, and Cassie guessed that he must be asleep. In the glow of the fire, she was able to see his features more closely. She guessed him to be in his late 30s. He had creases that bracketed the side of his mouth that was a harsh slash in his face. He had a long straight nose and black sooty lashes that sat on high cheekbones as he slept. Hope stretched up a chubby fist and let out a sigh, pulling Cassie's eyes from the stranger who had saved her today. She knew that she should be worrying about wild animals, about how she had survived, about what she was going to do about this little girl that had been entrusted to her, about how John would react to a temporary house guest. Overcome with exhaustion, Cassie fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Chapter 8. Flynn. He'd woken that morning and had found himself wrapped around the bundle of blankets containing the baby and his hand on the curvy waist of his charge. At first, his instinct was to jump up and run away as the scene was too domesticated, full of too many painful memories of waking up with a woman next to him, but he didn't want to disturb them. He'd studied her face in the pale dawn light that shafted in through the entrance, relaxed in slumber, and wondered if John Howard knew how much of a lucky son of a gun he was. The woman was beautiful and could have any man she turned her attention to. He wondered what it was that had driven her to get on that train in the first place. Boston was a world away from the dusty mountain town of Eagle's Peak. He carefully extricated himself from the warmth of their makeshift bed and went out in search of snow for water and a natural break. He was pleased to see the sky was a clear Carolina blue, and the crisp mountain air was still. When he walked back in, Hope was sat up, looking around her. He tried to get to her in time, but she was already tapping Cassie in the face to wake her up. The annoyed expression turned to one of momentary confusion as she opened her eyes and looked about the unfamiliar surroundings before she covered her face with her hands. "Oh, it wasn't a bad dream, men." Flynn set about packing up the equipment. "No, ma'am, it was not. The sky is clear. We need to leave now. See how far we get today. There's a lot of fresh powder out and about, so I'd say we've had a good 10 inches. Cassie sat up, scrubbed her face. "What, no coffee? No hot cakes and sausages?" She picked up Hope and placed her in her lap, shook her head at the little girl. "What kind of hotel is this?" she said in a baby voice to her, and Hope giggled with a hand clap. "There's beef in the pack, and I filled the canisters up with snow," he said matter-of-factly. The domesticity of waking up with her, of where his mind kept wandering when he thought about that smooth expanse of skin that he had treated last night, was a source of distraction that he couldn't afford right now. It had been years since he had seen such feminine curves, and his body kept reminding him of this fact whenever the image slipped into his mind. She was betrothed to another, he reminded himself. Plus, she would be hard work. She didn't believe in love, whereas he knew what it felt like to love and then to lose. Flynn Reid didn't need to run the risk of more heartache, and so would treat her respectfully, from a distance. He would get them to Eagle's Peak, go back to his work, to his life, and forget about the amber eyes and what they did to his gut. Cassie sighed, reluctant to leave the warm cocoon of her bedding. His curt tone spurred her into action, even though it also irritated her. She was keen to get back to civilization and a proper bed. She pushed the blankets back and shrugged into the woolen coat he'd found for her yesterday, adding her shawl. She chatted to Hope as Flynn rolled up the blankets and fastened them to Nutty. He seemed keen to be rid of the burden of his responsibilities, and she wondered if he was regretting the decision to lumber himself with the task of helping them back to safety. It was a glorious winter's morning as she left the warmth of the cave. She gasped as she looked about her. The trees were covered in snow, glistening in the sunlight, the smooth blanket reflecting the sunlight to the point it hurt her eyes. "Wow, it's so picture-perfect," she said, shielding her eyes with her hand. "Like something out of a Christmas postcard." He grunted at her and she sighed. She pulled herself up onto Nutty's back, refusing his assistance, and reached down for Hope. She gave her some dried beef to gnaw on and watched as Flynn tied on strange-looking contraptions to his feet. He explained that they would help him not sink so much into the snow. They set off, but the going was slow. Flynn walked steadily, and Nutty followed him diligently through the trees and down to the road that was only visible as a space between the tree lines. There were no other markings in the snow as they walked. Cassie chatted away inanely, trying to entertain a bored toddler, remembering the way Adelia had done the same during the first day in the coach. It was mentally draining. Flynn trudged in front of them, pausing every now and then to look about as if he was trying to gauge his bearings. Cassie longed to ask how far along they were, but refrained. Flynn had enough on his plate trying to get them both home. They stopped for natural breaks and to feed a fractious child. "We're going to have to make camp," he said as the sun was sliding towards the horizon, glinting gold through the trees. "We're losing the light already. We still have another maybe 4 hours." Cassie slid down, her backside protesting profusely, and she was stiff from being sat in the saddle. Gritting her teeth, she followed his instructions as he set up a hide, stringing the leather sheet between 2 trees where the ground was flat. He gathered up kindling and firewood as Cassie set up blankets and tended to Hope. When the fire was roaring and her belly was full from a watery stew that he'd cobbled together from chunks of last night's meat, with some leaves, the silence between them seemed to change. Cassie turned from her contemplation of a sleeping Hope to find those gray eyes resting on her. With her body battered and sore from the crash yesterday and being on a horse all day today, it didn't seem feasible that her body would now roar to awareness. She felt her breathing change under the scrutiny and had to moisten her lips. She swallowed, cleared her throat. "Where are you from originally, Flynn?" "Oregon, mostly." "I've never been. What's it like there?" "It's green and hilly and flat and sandy." The corners of his mouth lifted. "It depends on what part you're from. I came here afterward." "After the war?" "After that, after Sarah had died." After he had nothing left to lose, he nodded, breaking the eye contact to poke at the fire. I came here looking to find gold, didn't we all? And did you? He shook his head. No, ma'am. Are you going to tell me why you left Boston? She rolled her lips, knowing he was deflecting from himself. She looked at him, wondering why she felt comfortable enough to talk to him. My stepbrother, she admitted finally. My stepfather wanted me to marry his son, keep the money within the family. There were no other men in Boston? She smirked. None that held my interest. I know that makes me sound like a child who wants a favorite rattle. I just thought that maybe there was something wrong with me, as all my friends were falling in love and getting married. I did try, had a fair amount of gentlemen callers, but she lifted her hands up and let them drop. None of them were a good fit. Then Philip, that's my stepbrother, got more and more insistent. The night before I left, he got quite physical and tried to push the issue. I made it quite clear of my answer. Her eyes fell to her knuckles as she remembered striking him. Needless to say, I probably won't be welcome back in my stepfather's home after I belted his angelic son. Flynn's eyes danced in the firelight as they gazed at her. I'm sure that would have been a sight to see. Maybe you just haven't met the right one yet, Cassie sighed. That's what my mother said, time and again. A prosody rate +7. It seemed to settle for a friendship with a stranger was preferable to being chased around the drawing room by Philip Hopkins and his sweaty palms. Flynn chuckled at the vehemence in her voice. Hence why I was on that couch yesterday. Her hand went instinctively to Hope, and she brushed the golden curls. I wanted to thank you, Flynn, for coming to check. If you had just carried on. He cleared his throat at the emotion that shimmered through her voice. You should get some rest. I'll keep watch. You're not going to sleep? We're not quite as protected as we were in the cave. Most animals don't like fire, so I'll keep it lit tonight. Her eyes shot around the darkness that encircled the camp as her fingers fluttered to her throat. It'll be fine, Cassie. I'll keep you safe. She smiled at him, her whole face lighting up, and his brows fell. Cassie believed him wholeheartedly. For some inexplicable reason, she trusted this man unreservedly. Chapter 9. Flynn watched as she settled down for the night. He was sat leaning up against the tree that held the one side of the hide. She picked up her blankets and the sleeping child and moved closer to him, wrapping the two of them in the blanket and placing the one edge over his long legs. As she fell asleep, her breathing evened out and her face relaxed. In the glow, he was able to look at her without caution and drank in the sight greedily. When she had smiled at him earlier, the trust in her face had nearly undone him, and he had felt something move in him. That something had long been dormant and scared him witless. She was promised to another, yet he felt a sense of duty to them both. She sighed in her sleep, and a fine tendril slid across his cheek. Unable to help himself, he reached out and touched the silky strand, moving it back behind her ear so that he could look at her face without interruption. When his hand moved back, those amber eyes were on his, careful in their regard. He held his breath as she looked back at him. Maybe it was the whole strange scenario, where he had to use skills long since used, where he had her simple trust. Maybe it was being involved in the aftermath of such a dreadful and scary accident yesterday, and seeing that death and destruction strewn down the hillside, that made him feel this way for the woman he'd just met. Her eyes drifted closed once more, breaking that contact, and Flynn felt the loss deep inside. He sighed and knew that he was in deep trouble. Cassie rose the next morning, having woken before Hope as the first gray fingers of dawn slid their way through the surrounding forest. Flynn had kept the fire lit as promised through the night, and they had stayed warm. The snow had begun to thaw, and the forest around them was sodden, alive with the sound of birds singing and water drops shining like crystals in the morning sun. They quickly made their way back to the road after packing down their makeshift camp, and it pleased Cassie to see that they were now going down off the hill. As Nutty ambled on, Flynn walked on ahead, quieter in himself than he'd been yesterday. He had left off the snowshoes today, his boots crunching through the icy crust of the snow. Today, there were wheel tracks along the route. It was the first sign of life Cassie had seen in what seemed like eons. When Cassie had asked him if he was sick, his brusque reply had been that he was just keen to get to the town today. She wondered about his life that he was eager to return to. She'd not asked outright if he was married. Indeed, he had seemed reticent when she had asked about being in love. She was eager to return to her life too, she acknowledged, although she knew not what her new life would be, especially now that she had a child in tow. Would John be happy to meet her? Was he worried as the coach clearly hadn't shown up when it was due? As she rocked to the horse's gait, with hope secured to her abdomen by her arms, her eyes were drawn to the sky. It was such a bright blue, it made her eyes hurt. The air was so pure, it was a delight to inhale. It was such a contrast to the smoky, smelly air of Boston that she kept taking sharp breaths in till she began to feel dizzy, and she giggled to herself, drawing a look from Hope. "Look, Hope," she said excitedly as she saw the first building, the first sign of civilization, a single dwelling in light gray with a darker apex roof. Before long, Cassie could see more buildings, dotted haphazardly over the ground. Wagons and people milling about. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and she felt the tears prick the back of her eyes. She should have arrived here 2 days ago, met her future husband, and started her new life. For a while there, she had thought that she wasn't going to make it. She squeezed her eyes shut against the sense of loss and guilt that she was sat there with Hope, not Adelia. Eagles Peak looked to be a moderate-sized town, boasting an array of businesses: mercantile store, dry goods, a bank, a barber's, and it seemed several saloons. The buildings were wooden, with wide porticos over the walkways. The ground was muddy, where wagon wheels had carved the ground into ruts that were filled with water. Flynn lifted his hand as several people called out. Cassie grew aware that she was drawing curious looks from several observers. They passed the stables and what must be a blacksmith, judging by the open-frame structure around a large fire, and came to a stand outside the sheriff's office. Flynn turned and collected Nutty's reins, looping them over the rail that was outside the building. She supposed it made sense. Flynn might not know what to do with them. He also needed to let the authorities know of the tragedy that had befallen the coach, for surely the passengers would be missed by someone now. He held his hands out and she passed Hope down to him, who kicked her legs in glee, and then wrapped her arms around his neck as she watched Cassie slide awkwardly to the ground. She rested her head a moment against the shoulder of the mare and waited for the blood to return to her backside. "Sheriff," a voice shouted, "you're here. For sure, we thought you were done for when you didn't show up." Cassie turned her head to look over her left shoulder, her brows knitted together. The two men shook hands as the newcomer eyed up the baby and then the young girl behind him. "Sheriff? Ran into some trouble on the hill," Flynn said by way of explanation. "There was an accident. Can you run over to the post office and have Bill come by? I need to send a message to the stagecoach company." The newcomer was looking at Cassie as he nodded and was about to turn. "Oh, and Bob, send someone out to John Howard's ranch? Let him know his package has arrived?" Cassie had turned fully to glare at Flynn. "You're the sheriff? You didn't say." He handed Hope back and began unpacking Nutty. "You didn't ask. I asked how well you knew the town and if you knew John Howard. You could have said there and then. You're not even wearing any insignia." He paused to open the top 2 buttons of his coat that he had kept on for the past 2 days and pulled the flap to one side. A tin star sat on his chest. She was about to launch into a tirade at him when they were joined by 2 more people. "Sheriff, the stagecoach hasn't arrived." "I know, Sam." Flynn passed a pack to him, unstrapped another. "This here is Miss Cassidy Bell and Hope. They were the only 2 survivors. It looks like the coach was struck by a landslide or an avalanche up on the pass. We need some soup or stew and a coffee. I have to let the company know, and we need to get back up there, see if we can retrieve those bodies before the wolves get there." Chapter 10. Cassie was surrounded by activity as more people came out as the word spread. She stepped into the sheriff's office and was placed into a chair in the corner. The office was neat and practical, with minimal furniture, a desk and 2 plain chairs. Wanted signs were on the wall next to the window, and 2 small cells were fenced in by bars, both empty except for neatly made cots against the wall. One of the people lit the fire. An older lady who wore a brown dress and a shawl came in with cans of soup and fresh bread, which Hope and she devoured quickly. With warmth from the fire and a full belly, Cassie was able to observe Flynn in his natural habitat. His big frame filled the space well, but he had sure movements that made him seem more efficient. He dragged his hand through his dark hair more than once, the only outward sign of the pressure he must be feeling with having to deal with the situation. He seemed well respected, and his orders were obeyed without question. She garnered from the conversations that Flynn oversaw the townships and outlying lands. He had been visiting the smaller town that lay on the opposite side of the hill, and was on his way back on the day he had happened upon the accident. A telegram was sent to the coach company to advise them of the accident, and more people stopped by, curious to meet her. It was some time later when an older gentleman stepped into the office. He wore a smart black coat, white shirt, and a bow tie, with black trousers tucked into long leather boots. He removed his hat as he closed the door behind him. He had white hair, and his face was weather-worn. His dark eyes lit upon Cassidy, and he smiled. "Afternoon, John," Flynn said, and stood up from behind his desk. "Flynn," he nodded in response, his eyes sliding back to Cassie. "You called for me to come in for a package?" "Yes, I did." "Well, I was waiting on the coach to come in, but it hasn't arrived yet. I'm afraid it won't. There was an accident." Flynn explained that he had come across the site on his way back to town. "This here is Miss Cassidy Bell. I believe you were waiting upon her arrival." John looked relieved and turned to greet her. "Well, I am mighty pleased that you survived, and that the good Lord shine down upon your beautiful head," he told her, his hat held to his chest. "I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and then when the coach hadn't arrived, well, we were all in a tizzy about what to do, without a sheriff here to lead us in the face of a crisis." Cassie set Hope down and stood to meet him. Now that she was here, finally meeting her future husband, she felt like she was cast adrift and heading to a destination that she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. She felt like she was a different person from the woman who had written those letters to him. Suddenly she wanted love and dreams and laughter, not the accounts books and practicality that she had agreed with him. He was not how she imagined him, but had she spent time picturing her husband? She had just seen a practical way out of her Boston life, with no real thought on the result. She smiled, though, as was polite, and hoped that her disappointment didn't show. "Hello, Mr. Howard." He gave her a small bow. "John, please. I was hoping you would be as pretty as you said in your letters. I'm afraid we've missed the arranged appointment with the pastor to marry us, but I can make new arrangements. I'm quite impressed that you managed to survive a snowstorm on your own." "I wasn't alone," Cassie explained. "We were very lucky that Mr. Reid was where he was when he was. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known about the cave, or how to start a fire. He saved our lives." John's eyes looked at the sheriff. "You took her to the cave?" "Yes, I could see the storm coming in. Progress was slow, and we had to make camp a second night. I thought you had come across her today. I didn't realize that you have been having a fine and jolly time with my future wife." Cassie gasped, but it was Flynn whose voice was cutting. "I don't like what you're suggesting, John. I was there to protect and help, as I have sworn to do. There was nothing untoward that happened." John crossed his arms. "You mean to tell me you holed up in a camp for 2 days and didn't take advantage of an available female when you've been alone all these years?" "That's precisely what I'm saying." Flynn's nostrils flared with irritation. "Just what do you take me for?" Cassie demanded angrily as her temper licked through her. "I have a reputation to protect, and Flynn has better decorum than to force himself on a defenseless woman. I went through an incredibly traumatic experience, and what you're suggesting is beyond comprehension. That I am wholly disgusted that you would even breach the subject. Is this what I can expect from you?" John looked between them both, and his eyes narrowed as he considered their angered expressions. Then Hope patted Cassie on her thigh. She bent for the child automatically, and John stepped back in horror as he saw the tenderness with which she held the little girl. "You didn't mention you had a child?" "I don't. Her mother died in the crash." Cassie pressed a kiss to Hope's cheek as she fiddled with Cassie's collar. "She's an orphan." "Oh," John let out a sigh of relief. "There's an orphanage about 30 miles from here. I'm sure Flynn can arrange for her to be taken there. We need to discuss what happened on that hill. We can do that in private, if you'll just give the child to." Cassie held Hope to her, swung her shoulder back as John indicated the door. An orphanage? I'm not taking her to an orphanage. She watched her mother die 3 days ago. John sent Flynn a self-conscious grin. And that's a sad story, he said quietly, but I made my views on children perfectly clear. I believed that you were in agreement with me on the subject. 6 months ago, she had been. Heck, even last week, she was. Children hadn't ever been on her life scale of what she wanted to achieve. Until she had held the warm, squirmy bundle, watched her chest puff as she slept, listened to her gurgling laughter as she jigged about on Nutty's back. Even as they rode into town this morning, letting Hope go hadn't even factored into her plan. She thought that as soon as John clapped eyes on her, he would fall in love. I need to get her back to her family. I made a promise to her mother. They can do that from the orphanage. They will tend to her needs. They have lots of children there who are the same as she is, he told her. Cassie's eyes moved from John to Hope, and anguish twisted her insides. She couldn't let her go. She couldn't have strangers look after her whilst she hunted for her extended family. She wanted to be the one to tell them of how their daughter had been in her last moments. The strong and independent ice queen that Cassie had made herself out to be for all these years had been undone by a cherubic toddler. No. The word was out without conscious thought to push it out of her mouth. She fixed John Howard with a look. I'm not leaving her. The older man's lips thinged in frustration, and Cassie gazed back at him. He seemed to war with himself, and she realized that she knew Flynn more than she knew the man she had been conversing with for half a year. The man who stood before her was a stranger. He had accused her of unholy dealings with the sheriff and rejected one of God's children. She looked to Flynn, whose calm and steady gaze seemed to bolster her. I know what I said to you in my letters, but that was before I nearly died. I'm sorry, Mr. Howard, but I cannot leave her, and I don't think that I want to marry you anymore. Fury blazed through John's dark brown eyes. He pointed a finger at her. You have wasted my time. You and your erratic woman ways. You're all crazy. He turned at Flynn. You turned her against me with whatever you did to her in that cave. I know that you had your wicked way with her, Flynn Reid. I won't believe a word to the contrary. You're on your own. He threw over his shoulder as he stomped towards the door, and it crashed back into its frame as he slammed it shut. Hope began to cry, and Cassie bounced her gently, cooing to her as her eyes filled with tears to match. Hush now, she murmured, kissing her curls. Are you okay? Flynn asked from across the room. Cassie's amber eyes were filled with uncertainty as the chasm of her unplanned future yawned before her. It seemed that her carefully laid plans kept skewing each time she thought that she had a grip on them. She dashed a hand to her cheeks, wiping irritably at the tears. Sure, she laughed shrilly. I've just thrown away the reason I came out here. Found out he was a base ogre and no different to any of the men in Boston. My clothes are buried amongst a load of dead bodies somewhere on the hillside, along with my bag full of my money and jewelry. So now, because I'm an idiot and have no control over my rash decision-making, I'm thousands of miles from home, and oh yeah, I now have a child that I feel entirely responsible for. She dropped into the chair and began to rock Hope, more to console herself than anything else. Flynn's boots clicked as he crossed the floor and dropped to his haunches in front of her. Hope twisted and grabbed for his star, babbling to him as she did so. I'm sending a crew up to where the crash site is. Tell me what your bag looks like. We may be able to retrieve it. She pressed a cheek to Hope's head as she looked at him. His proximity seemed to soothe her nerves. She nodded. Thank you. I don't know if I've made the right decision. John Howard is a good man, just a little old-fashioned, especially for a city girl. He smiled, rubbing a hand over Hope's head and pulling her grabbing hand off his badge. Do you have a plan? Cassie rubbed her lips across the little girl's hair. I will write home, ask my mother to send me some money, head back to Boston, see if I can track down Adelia's family from there. Flynn's expression remained passive, and he looked to the little girl. I'm not sure how you will find them. Adverts, I suppose? My stepfather, as overbearing and oafish as he is, has influential friends in the city. I'll do what I can from here. I've sent a message to the travel company that they've lost a coach. No doubt they'll be getting inquiries through as to where all their passengers are, though as often as not, they can lose passengers to bandits and desperado types. He pushed to his feet. In the meantime, I can take you to the hotel. I don't have any money. Don't worry about that. You can have a bath there, get some rest, send your mail to your mother, though you know how long it takes to get a letter, so maybe send a telegram. You will have to stay in town for a few weeks yet. Chapter 11. Cassie. Absolutely not, Mr. Reid. The mousy hotel owner shook his head at Flynn, a determined set to his jaw. Rules are rules, Sheriff, and I can't break them for anyone, Flynn sighed. I understand your house rules, but I'm asking if you could see your Christian way and allow Miss Bell and her ward to stay. The bill will be covered by her family. They've both been through a traumatic experience. They could do with a little of the luxury that you have here at your establishment. For a moment, Cassie saw the compliment had done its job, and she thought that the hotel owner might give in to Flynn's persuasive talk, but he caught the eye of his stern-looking wife in the corner, where she stood like a sentry with her arms folded and a dark scowl over her craggy face. No, Flynn, I cannot allow a single woman to stay here. People will talk. I'll pay you up front for a week now, Flynn said. Please, Mr. Bartley. Cassie stepped forward, clutching hope in her arms. We have nowhere else to go. My family are very wealthy and will reward you well, I can promise. How do we know that? Mrs. Bartley sneered at her, lip curled derisively. I see your type here all the time. More often than not, they're running from scandal and have the morals of a dog. How can we trust you have money? You don't look like you have money. How do we know that that isn't your child? Your type always thinks they can pull the blinkers on men. Well, you can't put one over on me. No single women allowed. She shoved a finger at the signage above the desk. Cassie's mouth had dropped open at the insults, and her temper snapped along her veins. She stepped forward and was about to vent when Flynn caught her by the arm, thanking the older couple as he dragged her out. The wind slaked its way through her as she stepped out onto the walkway, chilly in its lazy path. I don't think I've ever been so insulted in my life, she muttered, pulling on her shawl to encompass Hope, too. I have to admit, that didn't go as I planned, Cassie sighed. Is there another hotel or a boarding house nearby? Flynn shook his head. The boarding house shut a few years ago. He showed her the empty building down the street as they walked back towards his office. There's nowhere else to stay? His lips thinned as he opened the door. You can come and stay with me, he told her. With you? She stopped in the open doorway as she stared at him. I can't. Being outside with him was one thing, but in his home, she wasn't sure she could. You'll have to, he replied. I just need to gather a few things and pop by to see Sam at the store. He will let me use his wagon that he delivers his supplies to the outlying properties, I'm sure. Cassie tried once more. Flynn, you have gone above and beyond in your role to protect this town in the past few days. I'm sure you want some alone time. I can't have vagabonds on my street. Besides, it's getting cold and the wind is picking up. My guess is we'll have fresh snow by the morning. He hadn't said that he wanted her to stay. In the same way, he hadn't said he didn't. She sighed as she followed him back out the door and along the street. Crossing the slippery avenue and into the store, it was well signposted inside, selling all items such as penny candy in jars, dry goods, and cheese wheels. Supplies were lined up on open shelves and racks about the store. Flynn greeted the owner and had a brief conversation as Cassie looked about the place. Flynn told her to pick out what she needed for both she and Hope. She added soap and a brush, shampoo flakes, and some candy. She saw the stunning wooden carvings that had been made and were being touted as Christmas gifts, and she remembered her conversation with her mother. I'll be mistress of my own home by Christmas. Instead, she would be homeless by Christmas, which she realized was less than 3 weeks away. There would be no plum pudding or Christmas presents wrapped, no decorations, and no roast ham. Now she had no prospects and no future. The tears started to flow, and she felt her resolve waver. Hope leaned forward and swiped at the tears as they trickled down Cassie's cheek. She turned from the display and fled from the shop, ignoring Flynn's calls. Flynn. Sam had offered to pack up the wagon and loan him a horse as Flynn left the store. He cast a quick glance up and down the street. The light was fading quickly, and he couldn't see Cassie anywhere. A lick of fear rippled through him, and he made himself not run and scream. She was sensible and wouldn't have gone far. He stepped to the edge of the walkway and peered around the corner, spying Cassie next to Nutty outside of his office. He walked across the road, avoiding the deeper puddles, his stance nonchalant as he took the sack he carried and added it to Nutty's packs. "Sam is going to lend us the wagon. It's about a 10-minute ride to my place. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. I have a big copper bath and we can light the fire." He heard her sniffles and his chest constricted. "I will keep my distance. Your virtue is safe with me," he murmured. Cassie gave a mirthless laugh that was more of a bark. "That's what you think I'm worried about? My virtue? My reputation?" He looked at her, at the anguish that twisted her features, her eyes shimmering in the lights from the lamps in the shop windows, giving her face a soft glow. "I have nothing to fear with you, Flynn. Had you been that way inclined, you would have imposed yourself as I slept next to you. I'm upset because this is not the life that I had planned, and I've made a huge mistake coming here. It's hard because no one wanted me in Boston, and now I pushed away John for the sake of a child that I've known a matter of days. My mother was right. I'm never happy with my lot in life. You want to know what I see?" He stepped in front of her so that she had to tip her head to look up into his face. "A young woman who has strong principles and who isn't afraid of a challenge. A young woman who is beautiful and who will go far in life. You can stay with me whilst you make contact and wait to hear from your family. I don't have much money, but I can promise that you won't go hungry. I must work so you can stay at the home with Hope. I'll leave you Nutty so that you can travel into town if you need supplies. If you can sew, I have some repairs that you can do whilst you wait. If you can cook, that would be a nice bonus." His mouth curved in a cheeky smile, and she returned it. The worry seemed to ease from her expression, and although his arms ached to take hold of her, he knew that it wasn't appropriate, neither would it be welcome. She had made her stance perfectly clear. She would be returning home. He just needed to get through the next few weeks, Christmas at least, and his life could return to normal. If that thought was an unsettling one, well, that was his problem, not hers. Cassie. The next few days passed by in a blur. That first night, she had bathed in front of the open log fire and scrubbed her body clean. Her injured side had been tender, but the hot water had eased her aching body. She then had to mop up the floor, as Hope had seen to it the most of the water had been thrown out of the tub with her enthusiastic squeals as she leaped about, drawing laughter from both her and Flynn. His home was the same as his office, simple in structure and practical in its contents. He'd only had the one cot, but had given it up for his 2 house guests, instead making a camp next to the fireplace, despite all of her protestations. Cassie had sent her telegram to her mother, explaining what had happened, that she was fine, but she needed help. She had a beautiful little girl as a dependent and couldn't abandon her. She asked for the ticket to get home and some traveling money to buy clothes and food on their way. The thought of traveling back alone filled her with dread, but she told herself that she would deal with that when it happened. Her mind had been tumbling over the words that Flynn had said on the first night in town, all those kind words that had helped her battered ego. Being in proximity to him was playing havoc with her senses, but she reminded herself this was only temporary, like some type of madness. She was surrounded by him, by his clothes, his scent, his property. Of course, he would be on her mind even when he was out at work. During the first day, Cassie had familiarized herself with the house, finding where he had kept everything. She'd been outside once and stared at the harness before giving up without even attempting to put the horse into it. He'd returned home that night to a cold fireplace. Rather than being angry with her, he'd taught her how to set a fire, how to light it and fan it. He showed her the harness, laughed at her when she threw the twisted leather straps that had bundled up on the floor in temper. She smiled when he had produced some sausages and hot cakes for their supper. She had cleaned the house and fed his chickens, which hadn't been as traumatic as she'd imagined it to be. She'd been sickened when he'd informed her that the crew had found the crash site, and whilst they had retrieved most of the bodies, including Adelia and Hank, the site had been stripped of valuables and clothing, no doubt by someone who had happened upon the place as Flynn had. She had attended the short burial service for Adelia and Hank, giving thanks for having met such a beautiful soul. Flynn and Cassidy had a certain rhythm to their routine. Not once had he berated or insulted her. She wondered if she should be more self-conscious about him, or whether her mother would raise an eyebrow at her living in sin with a man. Then it was as if her mother had set God to do the work for her. Chapter 12. Cassie reined the wagon in, feeling quite proud that not only had she harnessed Nutty, but also found her way along the route to the town. "See, Hope," she muttered, as she slipped down and held her hands out to the little girl. "I don't need a man to do things." Oh, she glanced down at the quagmire the street had become. "Maybe you won't walk through that. Come on, I'll carry you." She reached back for the pocketbook that was Flynn's and set off across the street, ignoring the little voice inside that told her she had needed a man to pay for the material that she was about to buy. She'd mentioned to Flynn the previous night that she needed to wash her shift dress, but both she and Hope only had one item to wear, and it would be easier if she had another to wear whilst she washed. He'd given her directions to the tailor shop and put out his wallet before he'd left. As she stepped up onto the walkway, her foot slipped and her injured side was pulled, making her suck her breath in. She'd used the last of Flynn's paste on the night she'd had a bath and needed more. She'd only been to the town once and been acutely aware of the curious stares that she was getting now, even from the tailor. "Can I help you?" "Yes, I'd like to buy some material." He stared at her for a moment, and she wondered if he'd heard her. "How much?" he said curtly. She blinked at the blunt tone, then caught the woman peering over the door into the back room and sighed. Another judgmental small-town cretin. "About 8 yards, she said. "Cheapest you have, please," thinking of Flynn's meager earnings that she was burning her way through. This wasn't her handsome income anymore. Hup wriggled to go down, but Cassie kept a firm hold. She did not need the toddler wreaking havoc in this shop. She struck the deal and kept mute, not wanting to even try and make small talk. The brown material was wrapped and tied with string. Cassie thanked him and juggled the door, the package and the child, letting the door slam behind her, and didn't bother to suppress the satisfied smile that the rude action brought her. As she stepped into the sheriff's office, juggling the bag and the baby, she cussed as the package slipped from her fingers. She tisked and kicked it in front of her. She looked up, stopped in surprise as she saw both Flynn and a strange man. The other man was rather rotund, with round wire glasses. Cassie recognized from his clothing that he was a pastor and blushed furiously as recalled her swearing. But it was Flynn's furious expression that caught her attention. Before she could ask him, Flynn stood up. "Pastor David. This is Cassidy Bell and Hope Murphy." "Hello," Cassie nodded and set a squirming Hope on her feet. She collected her package up and put it on the table. "Hello," the pastor replied. "I'm glad you stopped by. It saved us a trip out to the house." He gave her an apologetic smile. As nerves rolled through her, her senses clamored to attention, and she knew that something was amiss. "Is everything okay?" she asked Flynn. "It appears that there has been a meeting called at the town hall. They are not happy with me?" She raised her brows as he hesitated, and she pressed a hand to her chest. Flynn sighed, hesitated. "With us," he confirmed, and had the good grace to look ashamed. "I don't follow." Pastor David stepped forward. "I have been sent as a spokesperson for the township to appeal to the sheriff. It seems a group of people, led by John Howard, are not happy with the arrangement that you both have." "I've told him it was temporary," Flynn interjected, "that you were staying with me as there is nowhere else to go." "That's right," Cassie said, planted her hands on her hips. "Your sheriff is the only person in this town who has shown me any mercy so far. I've lost everything and have nowhere to stay. No money for food. I realize this. John Howard is insisting that you are to come and stay with me at the church house, though there is but one bed there, and I have my bad back, and I don't think that that is a viable solution." He eyed Hope as she began to systematically shred some papers she'd pulled from Flynn's desk. "Why do these people want to concern themselves with my welfare if they're not willing to help me?" Cassie's voice rose in the challenge. "They voted me in," Flynn admitted. "Therefore, they can have a say on how I conduct my personal life." The pastor put up his hands in surrender. "Having a couple living under one roof without the benefit of marriage, well, it's considered unsuitable and sinful. The church tries to keep a neutral stance on most issues, but he gave Flynn an eye. On this one, I'm afraid I agree. Cassie dragged her hand down her face. My message has gone home. Help is on the way. I just need a few more weeks. I'll be out by Christmas, maybe just after, she told David. When he shook his head, Cassie threw up her hands, stalking across to Hope to retrieve even more papers from destruction. So, what do you propose I do? That I marry you, Flynn said quietly. Chapter 13. Cassie. Her shocked eyes met his stormy gray gaze. She missed what the pastor was saying as her heart was slamming about in her ribcage. She could tell by his expression that Flynn wasn't happy about any of this, and her dismay was palpable. Of course, he didn't want to marry her. He hadn't courted her or shown any interest other than his kind words. In fact, this whole situation had been forced upon him through circumstance alone. He wouldn't want to saddle himself with more of a burden. She pretended to focus on Hope as Flynn dismissed the other man, but the silence that ensued after he'd left almost crackled with the tension. I'm sorry, she mumbled, not looking at him, or wanting to see how he politely extricated himself from her. I will move out. You shouldn't be forced to do something that you don't want to do. Flynn was quiet, and she risked a look at him. His jaw had a hard set to it as he stared beyond the darkness through the window he was stood by. I'll do it, he said. Otherwise, where will you both go? Flynn, Cassie pushed to her feet. No, you shouldn't be made to do this. It's madness. When he looked at her, his gaze was passive and unreadable. Look, when your folks send you some money, we can divorce. You'll be back in Boston, and this whole thing will be a distant memory for you. She swallowed down on the tears that his words evoked. It will be a marriage on paper only, pretty much the same as your agreement with John. He turned to look over his shoulder, but avoided her gaze. It's just temporary. It'll soothe over the feathers of the town and keep you both safe. She nodded as the tears spilled over the edge of her lids. She hadn't ever wanted romance, had thought the whole marriage and romance scene was made up. Yet with this man, she desired to have him court her and flirt and woo her, not the practicality of what he had just said. She realized that this pain that she felt inside must be love. They married at the church in the town the following day. Whilst she had once imagined her wedding day to be a more grand affair than just the three of them and a handful of nosy town residents, she now wished that she had had the beautiful gown she'd chosen to marry John Howard in. Instead, she had worn her grubby shift dress. She wished that she had had her mother there, and she realized that everything her mother had said about love and marriage was true, that you would just know when it was the right one. Sorrow welled up within as she watched Flynn avoid her gaze, and her heart broke to think of the sacrifice he was making for her. He was the right one, just the wrong time and the wrong situation. Her only nod towards any normality was that she had washed her hair and pinned it up. Hope had interrupted the simple ceremony several times by asking to be picked up, by upsetting a pile of Bibles in the corner, and by squealing. Flynn had brushed his hair back from his face and he had shaved. He wore a smart cotton shirt and jeans. At the prompt, Flynn had leaned in and bussed her cheek with his. The move was chaste and clinical, but her cheek tingled from his contact. And she blushed. They left the church, both pretending to fuss over a fractious Hope. They climbed up into the wagon, without a sound. Cassie bounced Hope on her knee, turning to look at the shop windows that were dressed now for the season, displaying their gifts and wares for Christmas, having decorated the displays with pine cones and berries. Misery shrouded her as she fought her tears. Nutty pulled the wagon through the slush, and the wind seemed to promise fresh snow. They left the town and made their way to the homestead. Today should have been a happy day, but she felt more miserable and alone than ever before. I'll need to go into town tomorrow. Flynn stood back from where he had just set the small cot he'd made out of roughly sanded wood in the corner of the room and eyed it critically. I can pick up anything you need, he murmured. They had been married for just over a week. After they had returned home on their wedding day, it was as if the ceremony hadn't really taken place, and they had simply returned to their customary routine. Flynn left each day for work. Cassie took care of the home and Hope. The whole sorry affair had been uninvolved. Her wedding night jitters, where she had briefly wondered if he may say a few words, had been dismissed as he bade her good night and bedded down in front of the fire. He had given no inclination as to whether he was annoyed or bored, just that same cool aloofness. Each day, she had hoped he would return with some contact from her mother so that she could begin to make plans to go home. As the days passed and she heard nothing, other issues began to make themselves known. "It's Christmas in 3 days," Cassie said now in a tone that told him it should be obvious, and he met her gaze in surprise. "Hope has nothing to open. She had had a bad enough year as it is. I want to give her something. I will pay you back when my mother sends me money, whenever that may be," she added sarcastically. "I want to decorate the house. In Boston, we would have had the decorations up for weeks. Food would have been bought and prepared. We have nothing in." She lifted her hands from her side. "I want to make the effort for her sake. I think that she deserves it." He looked across to the door to the room where Hope slept. "You can buy whatever you think she'd like. I think that is a good idea. I'm sure Sam would have something suitable. Maybe buy her a coat and bonnet too. That one she has is too small." Cassie smiled. "Thank you. You don't need to worry about paying me back. I'm happy to buy her something. She won't remember me when you take her back to Boston, so a dolly from the West might be a souvenir for her." Cassie watched him as he settled the blankets onto his cot, confusion reigning within. "You sound as if you're going to miss having Hope under your feet." She knew that Hope adored him, judging by the squeals of delight that she let out as she rushed to the door whenever she heard Nutty's hooves as he got home at night. She loved to clamber in his lap to fall asleep, and he would rub her hair after he'd carried her into the bed she shared with Cassie. "I guess having company has grown on me," he muttered. "I'll go shut the chickens in," he added as he strolled from the room. Cassie stared at the closed door. "You're wrong," she told it. "She will always remember the man who saved her, because I won't let her forget about you." Chapter 14. Flynn. "Since when do you do Christmas?" Sam leaned a hip against his wide wooden shop counter and folded his arms as he eyed Flynn. "Since now," Flynn replied, studying the pretty silver filigree pendants that the blacksmith had made. He already had a wooden truck and a dolly on the counter. When Cassie had mentioned Christmas yesterday, he'd been cross with himself for not thinking about it sooner. He'd been so wrapped up in trying to keep his distance from her, as well as the fallout from the coach crash and having to deal with the local unrest over his house guests. It hadn't even cropped up in his list of things to stress over. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. He'd checked the post office today, but the coach hadn't yet been through with the postal deliveries. It was probably delayed as the company waited for the roads to be clearer. Having a wife and child at home was the least of his problems right now. But when Cassie had said that Hope deserved a nice Christmas, he wanted to show Cassie that she deserved one too. The simple silver pendant that he picked up wasn't any fancy Boston jewelry that she may have lost in the crash, but he could easily picture hanging around that smooth, creamy neck. Maybe he wanted her to have something to remember him by too. A daily wait for the reply with the money from her mother was beginning to stretch his nerves taut. He wanted her to be happy, he wanted them to stay, he wanted to take her in his arms and never let her go. But she had made her position clear. He set the item onto the counter beside his other purchases, but Sam didn't move. Flynn glanced up into his friend's narrowed stare. "What? Does she know you're in love with her? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your wife, the woman you agreed to marry." "I had to, they had nowhere else to go." Sam simply blinked at his friend and lifted a brow. "They didn't," he laughed, running a self-conscious hand around his neck. "So, because a few of the old crusty misers from town told you, you did it. If they told you to jump from Eagle's Bluff, I suppose you would do that too then." "No, now you're just being ridiculous." "Am I?" Sam straightened up, got out his sales ledger. "And when this fancy city gets her mother's money, she's just going to waltz back there and you're going to let her go?" "That's right. Flynn, I've known you a long time. I've seen the women come along, throw themselves at you. I've seen them be sidestepped, albeit politely, as you did your job and helped them. Sent them on their way, seen them off carefully. I've seen that for more than a decade. Granted, none of them were put together quite as well as your wife." Sam enunciated the last word more deliberately. "And I have seen how you are with her. Have you told her that you love her?" Flynn handed over his money as he saw the tally in the book from Sam's calculations, pushing away the ludicrous words and started to pick up his purchases. I didn't know that relationship advice was now part of your sales patter. Maybe you ought to go see the medicine woman. Ask if she has something to knock the crazy talk out of your head. Tell her, Flynn, Sam called out as he reached the door. Before it's too late. Flynn had brooded all the way home. He wasn't sure what he felt for Cassie, and if he didn't know, how on earth could Sam know? All he knew was that whenever she was near, he felt more alive than he had in years. Having them in his home was a tonic that he didn't know he was missing. He untacked Nutty and put her in the stable, tossing in a good handful of hay over the door, listening to the rhythmic crunch of her jaw as she ate. He tossed the saddle pack over his shoulder and walked the short distance to his house, stamped the snow off his boots, and couldn't help the smile that spread over his face as he listened to the now familiar squeal of hope that was accompanied by her stomping as she pumped her little legs towards the door. He opened the door and scooped her up, screwing up his face as she lavished him with sloppy kisses, smacking his cheek for good measure. "Evening, little lady," he muttered. "You been good today?" He spied Cassie sitting on the floor next to a tree with what looked like a scene from another accident radiating out from her. Her look of despair made his lips twitch. "What happened?" "That little madam happened," she muttered in response, standing up and dusting off her skirts before she carefully picked her way through the mess. "I swear she makes the mess of a dozen children. You bought a tree?" "Sam helped me," she nodded. "He's such a friendly chap," she added. Flynn kept his opinion about his friend to himself as she continued. "In my mind, it was going to be perfect, like a project I could do with her, and she would be happy and entertained. Instead, this happened." She swept her hand out, where discarded cones and dried berries that had been partly strung were amongst pieces of popcorn, strands of ribbon, shards of salt dough ornaments, and yarn dollies that lay like wounded soldiers. Flynn started to chuckle, lifting a hand in defense when she turned the full force of her glare on him. "Let's get supper done and her to bed, and I'll help you finish the tree." He devoured the stew she'd served, dipping fresh bread into the meat juices, settled hope, and then sat with her at the table to finish the strings. "There was no coach today, so you had no post." He caught her look of surprise. "I'd kind of forgotten about it today," she murmured, as she concentrated on her task. "I guess I got caught up with this. It should be through here tomorrow, all being well," he added. "Seems strange to not be home for Christmas," she said after a while. "Do you have a big family Christmas?" She lifted a shoulder. "I guess. We go to church, have a family meal. We have presents to open, and either someone would play the piano, or we'd play games in the evening." She tied off her string and sat back. "How about you?" He thought about the last time he'd celebrated Christmas and realized he couldn't remember, hence why he'd been shocked when she'd mentioned it. He occasionally took the day off, spending it doing some chores about the house. He shook his head. "It's just a day like any others, normally. I mean, I go to church." "Did your family have any traditions?" "Mom made as much of a fuss as she could. She would wear a fancy hat, but we didn't do presents." "And your wife?" Flynn stared hard at the needle tip he held as he was swarmed with memories. He set the needle down and sighed. "We didn't get to spend a Christmas together. We married in the spring. I went to war. When I returned, she and her family were gone. There was no one left to tell me how she died." "I'm sorry," Cassie murmured, her eyes filling with concern. "That must have been hard for you. I don't know how good a husband I would have been to her anyway, had she survived. I was not the same boy who had left that town. I paid my respects to her grave marker and headed down this way. Been here ever since." Cassie watched him. "You must have loved her very much." Flynn met her gaze, held it for a moment, and felt his breath hitch in his chest. It was a strange sensation, talking about Sarah again after all this time, but he knew that what the boy had felt was nothing like the man felt now. "Let's finish the tree, shall we?" Chapter 15. Cassie. Christmas Eve dawned on a crisp, dry winter's morning that it seemed only happened in this part of the world. The clear azure sky stretched to the horizon, over the pasture lands to the rusty gold and gray mountains. Cassie had spent her morning collecting eggs, mucking out the stable, and finishing the pudding that she'd made. Whilst it wasn't her mother's plum pudding, it was at least a nod towards some semblance of civility. She ached for her mother in a way that she never had before. She wanted to talk to her about these feelings she had for Flynn, to announce to her friends that she wasn't a freak of nature, that she had fallen in love with a man, although he didn't reciprocate. She guessed that made her seem more normal. Hope loved being outside, enjoyed having the space to run about. She would hand-feed the chickens and pat the cattle, and Nutty was so patient with her as she ran around her legs. In fact, Hope was always easier to handle when she was out in the open air. Cassie wondered briefly what she would be like in a cloistered school in Boston, with a schoolmistress trying to order her about. She had only had Hope in her life for less than a month, but knew that she would now struggle to hand the child over to Adelia's family. She had made room in her heart for the little girl and dreaded the day when she would have to hand her back. It was Hope's excited squeal that drew Cassie's gaze, and she lifted her brows in surprise as she saw Flynn being followed by a buggy carrying 2 people. As she puzzled over why he would be home so early, her gaze was drawn once more to the buggy behind him. Cassie lifted her hand to shade her eyes from the sun, and for a moment she thought that she was hallucinating. Her mouth dropped open in shock as she recognized the familiar shapes of her mother and Ernest. Flynn hopped down, scooped up a bouncing Hope. Cassie caught his somber look before she looked once again at her mother. Ernest helped Eliza down, and she caught a sobbing Cassie in a hug. "Mama, what are you doing here? I was waiting for your letter. Goodness me." "Cassidy, like I was going to let you travel home alone after your last experience, with a child in tow, no less." Eliza cupped her daughter's cheek and pressed a kiss to her. "Hello, dear." Cassie laughed as her tears rolled down her face. "I can't believe it." "Well, believe it. The coach delivered us this morning. We had to set off in the dead of the night. The driver said we went the long way round, and let me tell you, he wasn't lying." Eliza looped her arm through Cassie's and started walking towards the house. "We were met by Mr. Reid here, and imagine my delight when he said that he knew where you were and that you, in fact, were married." Cassie shrank under the pointed look from Eliza. "Mr. Reid has been instrumental in helping me. He saved both of our lives, and the marriage was an arrangement to allow me to stay under his roof, a convenient agreement between parties." Eliza shot a look to the stoic cowboy who bounced the little blonde girl on his hip as though she'd been born there, and suppressed a knowing smile. If that wasn't a man in love, she was a jumping jack. "And he shall be rewarded, both on earth when I pay him some money, and in heaven," she said. "Ernest, isn't this just the sweetest spot on God's earth?" "Mm-hmm," Ernest replied and nodded a greeting to Cassie. "I'm shocked you're here. Mama, you're going to miss Christmas at home. So we'll have it here. Ernest has booked rooms for us all at the hotel. We'll leave on St. Stephen's, be back home for the new year, God willing. Now, let me look at you." She turned and held out her daughter's hands, her gaze taking in the faded bruise on her daughter's forehead. "You look a state, truth be told," Eliza laughed. "But you look alive and you look happy. I've brought you some clothes from home. They're at the hotel, though I have to admit, I'm guessing that they're not nearly practical enough for life out here. That nice man from the Mercantile dropped our luggage there for us. If you want to collect your things, we can leave now." Cassie's heart dropped to her feet. "Leave now?" Eliza smiled. "Yes, child. Why do you think we're here?" Cassie looked over to Flynn, who was staring at her, his eyes stormy. "But we have presents and a tree." "Pack your things and bring them with you," Eliza offered. "Would you like to come in for some tea first? Have a look round where I've been living for the past 3 weeks. Eliza looked to Ernest, who shook his head. "Sweetheart, we've been traveling for over a week to come and get you. I'm tired but wanted to see you with my own eyes. It's okay for us both to come back, even after what happened with Philip?" Eliza's nostrils flared. "The issue has been dealt with," she stated primly, shooting a look at her husband. "We were informed by Kathy what she'd interrupted, albeit reluctantly as it seems she was bribed. Philip has found work in New York. He won't be bothering you anymore." Cassie felt a wave of relief. This was what she had planned to do since she had arrived in town. To leave and go back to Boston, to what was familiar, to her old life. Except, she acknowledged, that life no longer existed. She was different. She had a child. She was a wife. Now that she had made her vows to Flynn, the townsfolk were much more accepting of her. They had begun to greet her in the street. She was starting to like the familiarity of the small town, even if they were a judgmental bunch. She looked about the house, the surroundings, the land, yet still she hesitated to go and pack. She looked at Flynn and Hope, where they watched her in the same contemplative manner. "Cassidy, what is it?" Eliza said softly, stepping up to her youngest child. The tone invoked a rush of emotion, and Cassie had to push the tears down. "Oh, Ma," she whispered. "It's a mess." Eliza's lips curved in a knowing smile. "How so?" Cassie warred with the words but knew it was futile. She had made her plans, and her mother had come all this way. She couldn't let them down. "Nothing," Cassie said, her voice stronger. She shook her head and set her shoulders back. "I'll come with you. Let me go pack up our belongings. You're okay with me having a toddler in tow?" Her mother looked at the cherubic child, who popped a grin at her when she knew that she was being watched. "Oh yes," Eliza smiled. "Another girl to add to our crowd of girls." Cassie stepped forward and pecked her mother on the cheek, loving her all the more for accepting Hope just like that. "I won't be long." She stepped into the house, closing the door as Eliza started up a conversation with Hope and Flynn. She could hear the muted tones as she glanced about the house. She and Flynn had spent the time decorating the room to make it more festive for Hope, and it made Cassie sad that they wouldn't get to spend the big day enjoying it. She looked at the simple fabrics she had used to make the place more homely, the tablecloth and the curtains. She sighed again and walked into Flynn's room, gathering up the few belongings that they each had. When she walked back into the central room, Flynn stood in the middle of the space. They took Hope. They're waiting for you in the buggy. I gave your mother the little coat I bought Hope for Christmas. It should do her to travel in, and I didn't want it to go to waste." She swallowed and nodded. She wasn't nearly ready to say goodbye to this man, hadn't been prepared in any way to leave him. "That's sensible of you." She set the items on the table. "I don't have much to pack." "A prosody rate. If I have left anything behind, maybe you can forward on?" He bobbed his head when she looked at him. She picked up her coat, slipped her arms in it, buttoned it up. She glanced at him as he stood, wringing his hands. She gazed at him, at the set jaw and the gray eyes that were shuttered. "Thank you, Flynn, for everything. I'm sure Ernest will forward any legal documents to get the marriage annulled. It won't cost you a penny. I'll make sure I settle up before I go. I'll leave the money with Sam." When he simply looked at her, she sighed. He seemed more closed off than ever. In her mind, she had envisioned a shaking of hands, maybe a hug so that she could store it in her memory. Now, she acknowledged that she must console herself with just the visions her mind conjured up instead. "Goodbye, Flynn." Her hand was on the doorknob when he spoke. "Stay." She turned to look at him. His face was twisted with anguish, as if he wanted to stuff the word back in his mouth. "Pardon?" His eyes closed as he sighed. When they opened, she had turned fully to face him from by the door. "I said, stay. I don't want you to go." His voice was quiet, and he walked to her, caught her by the hands as desperation urged him on. "Cassidy, the thought of not seeing you again, it's too much. I need you. You've brought me to life in a way that I didn't know possible. You've given my heart a purpose." Cassie stared up at him. "But Flynn, I married you because I wanted to. It was my idea as a solution to the problem, not the pastor's. I figured if I did that, then you'd stay, the same way you would for John Howard. I wanted to make you a proper proposal, but you started shouting and it got out of hand. You have seemed so angry about it all, though, because I felt like I had coerced you into staying, tricked you, but without telling you the truth. I hoped I'd have longer, but when your mother walked into the office this morning, I knew I'd waited too long for the right moment. You've seen what I have to offer you. It isn't much, but it's yours. I have a dangerous job, but I would give it up in a heartbeat if you asked me to. If you said that you wanted to stay, to have the chance of giving love a go." "Love?" "Yes, your husband loves you, Cassidy Reid." As he said her name, she had a small fizzle of excitement ripple through her. "He does?" Her heart swelled with her own love. She had nearly walked away from him. "Why didn't you say sooner?" "It seemed madness, and you looked set to get back east. I was so happy when you turned John Howard down. I think I would have gone mad with jealousy seeing you on the arm of another man." He paused as he searched her face. "Maybe in time you could learn to love your husband back." I just don't want you to leave with not knowing the truth, with not having the option to stay with me." Cassie tipped her head to one side as she looked at him. "I come with a child, an escapee from the bowels of hell, I'm certain," she added as an aside. "And I'm not sure I will want to hand her back when the time comes, although it has to be the choice of Adelia's family." "Okay," he nodded as possibilities sprung forth in those eyes. "It should also be noted that you don't need to give me time to love you back." Her words gave that sharp-cut mouth a curve, and he nudged her back against the door. "I don't? No, you really don't, seeing as this Ice Queen has been proven wrong. Love does exist. It's painful and annoying, very inconvenient." She looped her arms around his neck and stood on tiptoe. "And I don't want to live without it." "That's good to know," he murmured, fitted his body to hers, his eyes boring into hers as her heart slammed crazily against her ribcage. "Is it okay if I kiss my wife now?" Cassie nodded and tilted up her chin. "I checked." "She's agreeable to your kisses, Mr. Reid." His deep chuckle was soon silenced in their embrace, and for the first time in her life, Cassidy didn't have to try at loving someone or to pretend to care, to hope that she would get her chance at happiness. She just did. She was living her dream, here and now, with her husband. Epilogue. 2 years later, Christmas Day. "Mama, you're going to have to set Joshua down at some point." Eliza looked up from her rocking chair by the fire with her grandson in her arms and smiled at Cassie. "Not a chance. I'm going to drink in as much of this precious bundle as I can before I have to leave again." She turned her head to look out of the wide picture window. The house's interior was neat and tidy, having just finished being built the past fall. The window was one of the main things that Cassie had insisted be added to the extension, much to the annoyance of the builder and Flynn, who argued over the practicality of having all those small glass panes that would lose the heat in the winter. The arguments had been worth it for the views that she loved so much. Outside, winter had covered the ground in a crisp white blanket of snow, and the evergreens spiked up through it, with their snowy dusting glittering in the sunlight. Hope looked up from where she was playing with her new toys that she had unwrapped that morning. "What about me, Grandma? Will you drink me in too?" "Hope, my darling, you'll be lucky if I don't stuff you into my purse and take you back to Boston with me." "Maybe stop trying to steal my children," laughed Cassie. "Here, Mrs. Murphy, try this." Cassie turned to the older woman and offered her a spoonful of the sauce she was preparing to go with the huge Christmas dinner. It had taken over a year to track down Adelia's parents, but this was their first visit out here. She took a sip of the sweet sauce and nodded. "Tastes good, Cassie. I want to try." Hope jumped up and crossed to the stove. "Yuck," she said, and made them all laugh. "You don't like it?" "No," Hope replied. "Can I go play outside?" "Yes, but don't go far. Your supper will be ready soon." Mrs. Murphy helped her granddaughter with her coat, fastening the toggles and tying the bonnet on, dropping a kiss to her head. "She is so like Adelia, it makes my heart ache," she murmured as she watched Hope jump about in the snow. Cassie swallowed as guilt pushed through her. When she had extended the invitation to Hope's grandmother to come and visit for the festive celebration, she had known that it would be the end to having Hope in her life. She had steeled herself for this day and knew that she had only a week or so left. "I can see it in her eyes, too. I hope that Adelia is looking down on her and watching." The older woman shot a look at her husband and cleared her throat. "Thing is, we were talking, Abe and me. We like getting your updates and are so grateful for all you have done for her." Abe came to stand next to his wife. Cassie's nerves stretched with apprehension. Where are they going with this? "I'm happy to do it. She's a delightful child, bright and funny. I'm only glad I have been allowed to be a small part of it." "Well, that's it, you see. We see how happy she is here, how good a life she has. It's more than we can offer her. It doesn't seem right for us to take her away. It's another mouth to feed, and speaking frankly, we don't have the money for it," Abe said gruffly, blushing a bright red. "We see that you have a good business in that boarding house your stepdaddy set you up in. We see the beautiful home you have made here with Flynn." Mrs. Murphy linked an arm with her husband. "We like the contact, and we're so grateful to you for taking charge of Adelia's daughter. You're like her own guardian angel set by my sweet Adelia." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she took a breath. "We wondered if you can see yourself keeping her." Cassie couldn't help herself. As the tears spilled over her eyes, she threw her arms around them both. "I think that is the best Christmas gift I have ever had. I love that little girl like she is my own. She changed my life, and it would be an honor to be a part of it long term." Mrs. Murphy hugged her back. "Hope is a lucky girl to have you," she whispered fiercely. The front door banged shut, and Cassie met Flynn's concerned gaze as she moved back. "Is everything okay?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, everything is just perfect. Hope is staying with us." His face split for a grin, and he scooped her up in a hug. "For sure?" He set her down and pumped the hands of the older couple as he kept an arm around her shoulder. "I promised to do right by her. I love that little girl, and it was just killing me inside thinking about not seeing her again. It didn't seem right to pull her away from her new family after all that she's been through." Cassie saw her mother watching them and caught the nod of approval. Eliza had been an amazing support over the past 2 years, sending Cassidy the money to purchase the boarding house. The business was now thriving, filled with travelers and prospectors, as well as women who'd answered the ads in the Matrimonial Times. There was no rule about single women in her establishment. In that time, Cassidy had taken her modest income from her father's estate and used it to extend Flynn's house and purchase some land so that her husband could give up the dangerous job of being a sheriff. And Flynn took the opportunity with a flourish, working hard to make his ranch into a profitable one. She watched her mother nurse her infant son and knew that the terrible accident had been the catalyst for everything, that without the accident, her life would be in a different trajectory now. She thanked God every day for blessing her so. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of Sam and Mabel, his new girlfriend, who was followed in by Ernest and Hope, carrying gifts. She was expecting more guests today, and happiness shimmered about her. She set about finishing off the meal. Having the whole of her family that had been cobbled together in a mishmash of wonderful people here for Christmas was simply a delight for her. When Flynn slid his hands around her waist and nuzzled her neck, she leaned into him and smiled. "We have guests," she murmured. "I know," he whispered into her ear. "It's your fault for inviting them all here. If we were alone, we would be naked in front of the fire by now," Cassie gasped as he chuckled. "Flynn Reid, you are a man obsessed with his beautiful wife." She kissed him on the cheek. "There, that will do you for now. I love you, Flynn, but come on, out of the way." He squeezed her before he moved away, and she added vegetables to serving plates. She paused to watch as her family chattered away. Their laughter and their teasing mixing together in a way that only a family could, and her eyes were drawn to Flynn, where he lounged indolently against the large window frame. He looked over at her, and he gave her that smile of his. She was filled with so much love for him, it hurt. And tonight, when they were alone, she would tell him about this year's Christmas surprise, a sign of hope. Her hand dropped to her abdomen, and she smiled with contentment. The end.